My stepdaughter looked me in the eye and said the greatest gift for her wedding would be if I did not come. She told me I was not her real dad. I was just Victor, the man who wrote the checks. My wife sat right there next to her and stayed silent. She did not defend me, not a syllable, so I granted them exactly what they'd asked for. I vanished. But before I walked away, I made certain every asset bearing my name came with me. I sold the roof over their heads and tore up every vendor contract one by one. What I left behind in that gutted kitchen told the whole story: a folding chair and a receipt for $0. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories, the place where the truth always has a way of catching up. Before we get into today's story, if these accounts of justice and reckoning speak to something in you, a quiet like and a subscription mean more than you know, they keep this going. Quick question. While you settle in, are you listening on headphones right now, or are you letting it play through a speaker? I always wonder, because a story this close and personal feels different, depending on how it reaches you. One last thing before we begin: some elements of this story have been dramatized for the purposes of storytelling. Any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. My entire career was built on spreadsheets and risk assessment. 30 years as a chief financial officer for a Fortune 500 company. I know a bad investment when I see one. What I failed to recognize was that the worst one I'd ever made was sharing a roof with me occupying the master bedroom while I retreated to the guest room down the hall. Last Friday night was meant to be a celebration. We were at Alinea, one of the most expensive seafood restaurants in Chicago. The lighting was low, the tablecloths a crisp white, and the air carried that particular scent of old money and quiet judgment. Across from me sat my wife Diane and her 26-year-old daughter Brittany. Brittany was radiant in that manufactured way, the influencer glow that comes from weekly facials and a life completely unburdened by manual labor. She had her phone out, most likely checking the engagement on her latest post about wedding stress. I sat there sipping my still water, waiting. The waiter set the bill on the table, heavy and bound in leather. Without glancing up, Brittany slid a cream-colored envelope across the white linen toward me. The official wedding invitation. The paper was thick, hand-pressed cotton with gold leaf lettering. I recognized the texture intimately. I was the one who had written the $5,000 check for the printing. I opened it, expecting to find my name at the top as the host. Traditionally, that honor belongs to the father of the bride, or in this case, the stepfather who had funded every last detail. I scanned the elegant script. Mr. and Mrs. Dean Colwell request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Brittany. I went still. Dean Colwell, her biological father, the man who hadn't contributed a dime in child support since 1997, the man who materialized once a year with a hangover and a cheap toy, then evaporated the moment rent came due. My name was nowhere to be found. I looked across at Brittany. She wasn't looking back. She was using her butter knife to dissect a scallop. Brittany, I said, keeping my voice level. I think there's been a misprint. My name is missing. She lifted her eyes. That shade of blue identical to her mother's, and carrying the same capacity for cruelty. It's not a mistake, Victor. We talked about this. Dean is walking me down the aisle. A cold pressure settled in my chest. I set the invitation down on the table. But Dean isn't hosting this wedding. I am. I've already put down $8,000 in deposits. The venue, the flowers, the catering. Dean hasn't contributed a cent. Brittany exhaled one of her theatrical sighs, the kind she deployed when a waiter brought tap water instead of bottled. Please don't turn this into a money thing, Victor. You always do that? This is about aesthetics. Dean is my real dad. He has that rugged artistic quality. It fits the vintage vineyard vibe we're going for. You have to admit you come across a little corporate. You look stiff in photographs. We want the pictures to be perfect for Vogue. I turned to Diane, my wife of 15 years, the woman I'd taken on Mediterranean cruises, whose debts I'd absorbed the day we married. Surely she'd intervene. Surely she'd say, "Brittany, that is breathtakingly disrespectful to the man who paid to straighten your teeth and fund your degree from Northwestern University." I waited. Diane lifted her Chardonnay, touched the napkin to her lips, and looked somewhere past my shoulder. "Honey," she said softly to me, not to Brittany, "it's her special day. We just want her to be happy. Dean is family. You know how sensitive he is about his place in her life. We don't want him feeling pushed aside. So pushed aside." The words just sat there. The man who had abandoned them was family. The man who covered the mortgage was an accessory that clashed with the color scheme. I looked down at the leather bill folder. $950 for a dinner at which I'd been told I wasn't photogenic enough to be a father. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't upend the table. 2 decades in corporate boardrooms had taught me that emotion is where leverage goes to die. I reached for my American Express black card. The heavy metal card clinked against the china. "I understand," I said. "I want the photos to be perfect, too." Brittany clapped her hands. "Thank you, Victor. I knew you'd come around. Oh, and since you're being so understanding, Cody and I were thinking about upgrading the champagne toast to Cristal. It's only an extra $400-500. I studied her smile. I saw the orthodontic work I'd financed. I saw the dermatology appointments on my tab. I saw the entitlement I had watered and fed for 15 years straight. "Order whatever you like," I said. The drive back to Illinois was silence from start to finish. The Mercedes cabin was soundproof, sealing us in with the tension like a vacuum. I drove. I always drove. Diane sat in the passenger seat scrolling her iPad. Brittany was in the back, texting her fiancé Cody. I watched the city lights dissolve into the black ribbon of highway. My expression was stone. My mind was sprinting. The math I was running had nothing to do with wedding budgets. It was the arithmetic of my life. The retirement years I'd deferred to sustain their lifestyle. The investment portfolio I'd liquidated to purchase the house in Winnetka because Diane declared she needed to be nearer to her friends. Diane cleared her throat. In that silent car, the sound landed like a fingernail dragged across a chalkboard. "Victor," she said, her voice coated in that artificial sweetness she reserved for requests. "I was thinking since Dean is walking Brittany down the aisle, he needs to look the part. He doesn't own a proper suit." She paused, hesitated half a beat, then pushed forward. "You have that beautiful charcoal Brioni suit in your closet, the one you wore to the gala last year. You and Dean are roughly the same size now that he's dropped the weight. I was wondering if we could borrow it for him just for the weekend. We don't want him looking shabby standing next to Brittany." My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles bleached white. They didn't just want to erase me. They wanted to cannibalize me. They wanted to dress the deadbeat in my clothes so he could perform the role of the prosperous patriarch. It was almost darkly comic. It was grotesque. I pulled in a slow, deliberate breath. If I erupted now, I'd hand them the villain narrative. Jealous Petty controlling the full script was already written for them. I had to be smarter than that. I had to become the ghost they already believed I was. "Sure," I said. My own voice sounded flat and distant. "He can borrow the suit." "Really?" Diane's surprise was audible. "Oh, thank you, honey. You're being so gracious about all of this. I know it's uncomfortable, but it means everything to Brittany." From the back seat, Brittany chimed in. "Thanks, Victor. You're a lifesaver. Dean is going to look so hot." Hot. She was talking about her own father. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I reached for the radio and switched it on to bury their voices under something cleaner. A classical station violins filling every corner of the car. I needed to think. I needed a plan. The wedding was 3 weeks out. Final payments for the venue and caterer were due in 5 days. That was my window. 5 days to begin unwinding 15 years of lies. We pulled into the driveway of the colonial I'd purchased 3 years ago, a sprawling estate, white pillars, a manicured lawn whose upkeep alone exceeded most people's annual salaries. The porch light glowed. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. From the inside, it was a hollow shell. I carried the bags in. Brittany went straight to her room to FaceTime Cody. Diane drifted to the kitchen to pour another glass of wine. I told them I had work to finish in my study. I moved down the hallway past everything I had paid for. The Persian rug in the foyer, the abstract canvas in the hall that Brittany had insisted was an investment. The grand piano that cost $65,000 and that nobody ever played. I felt like an intruder touring a museum built entirely from my own exploitation. I stepped into the study and pulled the door shut behind me. This was the one room in the house that still felt like mine, mahogany shelves, the smell of old paper and leather. I lowered myself into the chair behind the oak desk. I didn't open the laptop. I sat in the dark and listened. Diane's voice drifted in from the kitchen. She must have assumed I was out of range, or perhaps she simply no longer cared. She was on the phone. He actually said yes to the suit. Diane was laughing a high, bright, tinkling laugh that sounded exactly like breaking glass. I know, right? I figured he'd put up a fight, but he's so desperate to be liked. He just caved. A pause while the other end responded. I knew immediately who it was. Dean. Yeah, well, he has his uses, Diane continued. We just need to keep him manageable until the honeymoon expenses are squared away. Brittany wants to go to the Maldives. That's another 20 grand. Once the wedding's done, we can have a conversation about the house. I think I can talk him into downsizing to a condo, cash out some of the equity. You could finally get that truck you've been after. My blood went cold. This wasn't about a wedding at all. It was a long-game extraction. They intended to drain me completely and discard what was left. Dean's voice came through the speaker, faint, tinny. What an old fool. Does he have any idea about the prenup? None. Diane scoffed. He thinks that finance degree makes him untouchable, but he goes to pieces when family is involved. He fancies himself the rescuer. It's honestly pathetic. He's just an old ATM that needs a little maintenance now and then. An old ATM. That phrase, that single sentence snipped the last remaining thread of anything I felt for these people. The slow burn in my gut stopped simmering and flash-boiled into something altogether different, colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. I crossed the room to the painting behind my desk and swung it aside to expose the wall safe. I worked the dial, left to 32 right, to 15 left to 8. The heavy steel door swung open with a click. Inside, stacked documents, passports, backup hard drives. I reached to the bottom and retrieved a blue folder. It was labeled Premarital Assets and Estate Planning. I set it on the desk and switched on the green banker's lamp. The light pooled across the pages. I opened the folder. Right on top was the deed to the house. I traced the legal description with my finger. Purchased by Victor Hargrove, sole owner. Because Diane carried credit problems from her first marriage to Dean, her name had never appeared on the deed. Our prenup stipulated that any asset funded by my pre-retirement accounts remained exclusively mine. The next document was the Revocable Living Trust, the instrument controlling every account Diane tapped for her daily spending. Below that, the wedding vendor contracts. Every single one bore my signature. Not Brittany's, not Cody's, mine. I wasn't just the ATM. I owned the bank, and the bank was about to shutter. I checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. on a Friday. The average person waits until Monday to phone their attorney. I have never been average. I scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in years and pressed call. It rang twice. Hargrove, a voice rasped back. Late hour, but Clive Pemberton never slept. He was the kind of lawyer you retained when you wanted the earth scorched. Clive, I said. Sorry for calling at this hour. You're the only client who apologizes. Clive grunted. What is it? You sound like a man looking at a body. Not yet, I said, glancing at the framed photo of Diane and me on the desk. I laid it face down. But I need to move a property fast. Cash buyer closed in 7 days. Which property? Clive asked. The one I'm standing in, I said. Silence on the line. Then Clive let out a dry, dusty chuckle. The Winnetka estate. Diane won't be pleased. Diane won't know, I said. Not until the locks are changed. And Clive, I need to stop some payments. Quite a few of them. I heard the click of a lighter and a slow, deep inhale. Start talking, Victor. I've got a pen. For the next hour, I laid out the entire architecture of their undoing. No raised voice, no tears. I simply moved assets from column A to column B. I directed Clive to trigger the penalty clauses in every wedding contract. I authorized the immediate transfer of the house to a holding company that specialized in distressed purchases. They'd take it at 20% under market if they could have possession in 48 hours. I told him to accept. I wasn't concerned about the discount. I would have burned the structure down if that weren't a crime. Losing money was a recoverable condition. Losing my dignity was not. When I set the phone down, the house was perfectly still. Diane and Brittany were asleep upstairs, dreaming of Brioni suits and Maldives beaches, completely unaware that the roof above them had already been sold, that the credit cards in their purses were already dead plastic. I moved to the window and watched the pool glowing blue in the dark. I remembered teaching Brittany to swim in that water. I remembered holding her through her first heartbreak. I remembered settling Dean's gambling debts to keep him out of prison so Brittany wouldn't grow up with a felon for a father. I had been a decent man. I had been a generous one. But tonight, Victor the father was gone. Victor the CFO was back at the helm, and the audit was going to be merciless. I returned to the safe and retrieved one final item, a velvet box holding a sapphire necklace I had purchased for Brittany as a wedding gift worth $18,000. I held it under the lamp for a moment, the stones catching the light. Then I dropped it into the wastebasket beside the desk. I switched off the lamp and walked out. I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. Diane was sleeping without a care, her breathing slow and even. I stretched out on my side of the bed, the side I paid for, and stared up at the ceiling. Tomorrow the performance would begin. I would play the compliant, ground-down stepfather for precisely 48 more hours. I would smile and nod and let them believe they'd already won. I would let them pump that balloon of arrogance until it was taut and straining. And then I would produce the needle. As my eyes closed, the invitation drifted back to me. Mr. and Mrs. Dean Colwell, I murmured into the dark. Good luck picking up the tab, Dean. Morning arrived with that particular aggressive brightness that only appears when everything around you is quietly collapsing. Brittany was already at the kitchen table, ringed by bridal magazines circling flower arrangements with a red marker. Diane was at the counter making smoothies, the blender whirring loudly enough to excuse anyone from speaking. Morning, Victor, Diane called over the racket. She poured a green slurry into a glass and pushed it in front of me. Drink up, you looked worn out last night. Big day ahead. Florist appointment at 10:00. Then we need to get to the tailor for Dean's fitting. I looked at the smoothie. Kale and ginger. The taste of penance. I took one sip and set it down. Actually, I said, I've been thinking we should expand the flower budget. Brittany's head came up instantly. Her eyes went wide. Really? I nodded my face, giving away absolutely nothing. I've been reflecting on what you said last night, about the aesthetics. If Dean is escorting you down the aisle, that path needs to be extraordinary. Those imported orchids, you like the ones from Thailand. Brittany let out a full shriek. Oh my God, Victor, those are like triple the price. Does that matter? I asked, spreading cream cheese across a bagel. You only get married once. Let's make it Vogue-worthy. Diane lit up. She crossed to me and kissed the top of my head. See, I told you he'd come around. He just needed a good night's sleep. I smiled back. Tight, thin, controlled, but they were far too busy with their own greed to read the room. Call the florist, I said. Double the order and put it on my account. I watched Brittany lunge for her phone, thumbs flying. She was texting Cody, no doubt reporting that the old ATM had resumed dispensing. While she was occupied, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Clive Pemberton House sale contracts executed. Buyer has wired funds. Escrow closes Monday morning. You have 48 hours to vacate. A current of adrenaline ran through me. It was done. The clock was running. We burned through the day at a breathtaking rate. At the florist, I signed off on a $20,000 archway. At the tailor, I covered the cost of rush alterations to my own suit, so it could accommodate Dean's midsection. I stood in that fitting room, watching the tailor pin the fabric of my Italian wool suit around the man who had been sleeping with my wife, while I was putting in 60-hour weeks 20 years ago. Dean was preening in the mirror. Not bad, Vic, he said, studying my reflection. You've got good taste. High bit snug across the shoulders, but I'll make it work. You certainly do, I said. He turned toward me and dropped his voice. Hey, about the bachelor party, Cody and I were thinking Vegas, just a quick weekend. We might need a small injection of funds, to do it properly. I looked at this man. He had no bottom. It was a limitless well of need. Send me the itinerary, I said. I'll handle it. Dean clapped me on the back. You're a good sport, Vic. I don't care what Di says about you being a bore. You're all right. I mentally added Vegas trip to the cancellation list for Monday. The weekend that followed was a masterclass in performative generosity. I became the yes man they had always wanted me to be. I approved the premium open bar. I approved the live string quartet. I approved the fireworks. With every approval, I watched Brittany's regard for me erode a little further. To her, I wasn't a father being generous. I was a servant who knew his station. By Sunday night, the projected wedding cost had ballooned to $150,000. Brittany was ecstatic. Diane was smug. Dean was drunk on my scotch. I slipped into my study and printed a single document, the confirmation of cancellation of all credit cards, effective Monday at 9:00 a.m. I tucked it into my briefcase next to the house sale papers. Monday arrived under a gray sky. I dressed in my work clothes out of old habit, even though I'd been retired for years. Where are you going? Diane asked from the bed, her silk eye mask pushed up on her forehead. Meeting with the financial planner, I said. The lie came out effortlessly. Just moving some funds to cover the wedding payments. Good, she murmured, rolling back over. Make sure there's enough for the honeymoon as well. I walked downstairs. The house was still. I stood in the living room one last time. I looked at the patch of rug where I had played horsey with Brittany when she was 10. A pang of grief hit me sharp sudden. It didn't have to end this way. 1 ounce of gratitude. A single line on an invitation that treated me as her father, but they had chosen differently. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me. I punched in the code on the lockbox I had mounted to the porch railing that morning and dropped the house key inside. I walked to my car and didn't look back. I drove to a coffee shop in town and ordered a black coffee. I sat at the window and waited. At 9:10 a.m., my phone buzzed a bank notification. All accounts frozen. Authorized user cards declined. At 9:15 a.m., the first text landed. Brittany. Dad, I'm at the spa. My card just got declined. It's so embarrassing. Can you fix it? I didn't reply. At 9:30 a.m., the real estate agent called. The moving crew is at the property, Mr. Hargrove. They're asking whether the residents are prepared to leave. I took a slow sip of coffee. Proceed, I said. I could picture the scene unfolding perfectly. Diane waking to broad-shouldered strangers boxing up her life. The confusion, the screaming, the earth opening beneath her feet. At 10:00 a.m., the phone began to ring without stopping. Diane, Brittany, Dean, Cody, the florist, the caterer, the wedding planner. I watched the screen cycle through name after name and felt a strange, spreading calm. The silence of that Friday car ride had been suffocating. But this silence, the silence of a phone ringing that I chose not to answer, was the most beautiful sound I had encountered in years. I let it ring. I had a flight to catch. But first, one final errand. I owed them a parting gift. I drove back to the house one last time. The moving trucks were already loaded and filling further. Diane was on the front lawn in her bathrobe, screaming at a man with a clipboard. She looked wild, unraveled. I pulled up down the street and observed. She spotted my car and broke into a run toward me, her face a mask of fury. "Victor!" she screamed. "What have you done?" I raised the window and drove away. The weekend had been a masterclass in psychological warfare. 40 years in finance had taught me how to identify a bubble, how to read the moment when a market inflated by hype and greed is just seconds from collapse. Only now I wasn't merely spotting the bubble. I was the one pumping the air into it. I watched them with a detached, clinical fascination as their appetites expanded to fill every inch of the imaginary budget I had set before them. Saturday morning began at the Floral Design Studio in downtown Winnetka. The air inside was dense with the scent of lilies and eucalyptus, a fragrance that has always reminded me of funerals. Brittany sat across from the lead designer, a woman named Renata, who clocked my watch the moment I walked through the door and adjusted her ambitions accordingly. Brittany was holding a sample bouquet of white roses, tasteful, restrained, affordable. "It's lovely," Brittany said without much conviction. She glanced at the pricing sheet and hesitated. "It's already at $8,000. Victor, are you certain we can go higher?" I settled back into the velvet chair and crossed my legs. I glanced at Cody, her fiancé, who was scrolling his phone, probably checking fantasy football, completely detached from the financial exposure he was about to absorb. "Brittany," I said, my voice smooth and level. "Don't look at the price tag. Look at the legacy. These photographs will exist forever. Do you want to open your wedding album 20 years from now and see modest roses or a cascading wall of orchids that announces royalty?" Brittany's eyes caught fire. She turned to Renata. "Show us the orchids." Renata's smile widened. She produced a new portfolio. The designs were extraordinary arches constructed from imported white Phalaenopsis orchids, centerpieces, that would require structural support to remain upright, a flower wall for the Instagram station. The revised estimate came back at $28,000. Cody finally surfaced from his phone. "Whoa, that's the price of a car." I leaned forward and held his gaze. This was a young man who had not kept a steady job for longer than 6 months. "Cody," I said, "it's an investment in your image. And don't worry about the cash flow. I've already initiated a transfer from my brokerage account. Just takes a few business days to clear." Cody's shoulders dropped. "Oh, okay, cool." Then came the trap. I patted my pockets and manufactured a look of mild irritation. Damn, I left my wallet in the other jacket. "Cody, you have your card on you, right? Just put the deposit down. It's only $5,000 to hold the date. I'll write you a check for the full amount Monday morning when the markets open. Plus, think about the points. You could probably pull a free flight out of a transaction this size." Greed is a powerful anesthetic. It deadens the survival instinct completely. Cody looked at Brittany. She gave an encouraging nod. He retrieved his credit card, a high-limit card his parents had co-signed, and passed it to Renata with a slightly unsteady hand. "Put it on the card," he said, performing confidence. I watched the terminal. Approved. The trap was closed. The contract bore Cody's name. The liability was his. My promise of reimbursement was nothing but air. We moved from the florist to the caterer for what was supposed to be a simple tasting. I had other intentions. The original menu was chicken cordon bleu. Safe, predictable, inexpensive. Dean arrived looking like he'd just rolled out of bed, a polo shirt straining across the chest, settling into the chair at the head of the table, as though he were the one with a card on file. "The chicken is dry," Dean announced, dropping his fork onto the plate. "If I'm walking my daughter down that aisle, we cannot serve dry chicken to 200 people. It reflects on the family." I suppressed every impulse to laugh. The only thing reflecting on this family was the man at the head of the table, but I nodded gravely. "Dean is right," I said. "This is a celebration. We need the food to make a statement." I flagged down the chef. "Bring out the surf and turf Maine lobster tails and the filet mignon." Diane's eyes went wide. "Victor, that adds another $100 per head. We have 200 guests." I reached across and covered her hand with mine. My touch was ice, but she read it as warmth. "Dee," I said, "I want you to be proud. I want your friends talking about this wedding for years. Let them have the lobster." The platter arrived Maine lobster tails with drawn butter steaks seared to perfection. Dean attacked a lobster tail with his bare hands, butter running down his chin. "Now this," Dean mumbled around a mouthful, "this is class. Good call, Vic." I watched the table. I watched Brittany photograph her lobster for Instagram. I watched Cody quietly calculate the reward points accumulating on his card. Because when the deposit invoice for the upgrade arrived, I made sure it went on their cards again. "It builds your credit profile," I told them. "Mortgage lenders love seeing you carry and clear large balances. I'll zero it out on Monday." They signed, they ate, they laughed. They were feasting on their own coming ruin. By Sunday afternoon, the bubble had grown enormous. We'd upgraded the bar to the premium platinum package. We had hired a 10-piece string ensemble instead of a DJ. We had booked a vintage Bentley for the getaway car. Every contract had been signed by Brittany or Cody. Every deposit had been charged to their credit cards or to the emergency savings account Cody's parents had set aside for a house down payment. Total estimated debt they had accumulated in 48 hours, $65,000. Sunday evening, we gathered in the living room. The energy in the room was electric. Brittany was running hot on the adrenaline of spending. Diane was regarding me with something between newfound respect and simple satisfaction that I had finally learned my role as the financier. Dean was there too, naturally reclining in my leather armchair, working through my 20-year-old scotch, as though he'd earned it. "To the happy couple," Dean announced, hoisting his glass. "And to me," Diane giggled, "for producing such beautiful children. And to Victor," she added as an afterthought, "for being so wonderfully supportive." I raised my glass of water. "To Monday," I said. They assumed I was toasting the morning I would wire the money. They had no idea I was toasting their destruction. Later that night, I went to my study. I needed to verify that the timeline was locked in. The house sale would close at 9:00 a.m. The movers were scheduled for 10:00 a.m. My flight to Italy departed at 2:00 p.m. I sat at my desk and looked over the stack of receipts Brittany had proudly delivered to me. She wanted me to know the precise total so I could write the check correctly. I picked up my checkbook. I uncapped my fountain pen. The ink was black and permanent. I wrote the date. I wrote the payee, Brittany Colwell. I wrote the amount. Then I stopped. I studied that check. It was a beautiful piece of paper. It represented security. It represented a father's love. I pulled it from the book. I tore it in half, then in half again, until it was nothing but confetti. I let the pieces fall into the wastebasket. There would be no check, no wire transfer, no rescue. I moved to the window and looked out at the driveway. Cody's car sat next to Brittany's. They were spending the night wanting to be close to the bank come morning. They were sleeping under a roof that no longer belonged to anyone in this house. They were spending money that had ceased to exist. They were erecting a future on a sand foundation while the tide came in fast. I went upstairs to the guest room. I had been moving my belongings in there quietly throughout the day. My suitcases were packed and stowed in the closet. My passport was tucked into my jacket pocket. I lay down on the single bed. It was stiff and narrow, but it felt more honest than the king-sized mattress down the hall. That bed was saturated with lies. This one was clean. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the house settle over me. The calm before everything broke. A few hours from now, the sun would come up on a completely different world. I drifted off, dreaming of lobster shells and wilting orchids. The clock read 5:00 a.m. when I woke. Monday. I showered, dressed in my travel clothes, and moved through the house without a sound. Dean was snoring on the living room sofa he had passed out there the night before. I stepped into the kitchen. The granite countertops were cold to the touch. This was the stage for the final act. I retrieved the envelope from my jacket. Inside was the letter I had prepared, the eviction notice from the new owners, and the cancellation receipts for the remaining items still in my name. I set the envelope dead center on the kitchen island. I placed a single folding chair facing it. It looked like an art installation, a monument to consequences. I checked my watch. 5:30 a.m. The crew coming for the heavy furniture pieces I was selling, not keeping, would arrive in 4 hours. I would be long gone by then. I picked up my suitcase and walked to the back door. I paused at the wall of family photographs. Brittany's graduation, Diane and me in Hawaii, Dean holding a beer at some backyard barbecue. I took them all down, stacked them face down on the floor. I had no use for them. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to bleed across the horizon, coloring the sky in shades of bruised purple and furious orange. I got into my car, started the engine, and looked at the house one final time. "Goodbye," I said quietly. I put it in gear and drove. The bubble was fully inflated, brilliant, shimmering, hanging high, and I had just released the string. While Brittany and Cody were busy running their credit limits into the ground on lobster and imported orchids, I was sitting in a corner booth of a 24-hour diner 3 towns over. The vinyl seat was split. The air reeked of burnt coffee, a stark contrast to the world I had just vacated. But this was where real business happened, when you preferred not to be seen. Across from me sat a man who resembled a shark, wearing an inexpensive suit. His name was Mr. Duval, a representative of a private equity firm that dealt in distressed assets. They purchased homes for cash, no questions asked, provided the price was acceptable, and the close was immediate. On the table between us lay a dense stack of documents, the deed to the Winnetka estate, an appraisal from last year placing the property at $2.8 million, and the contract Mr. Duval had just slid in front of me. I put on my reading glasses and found the number at the bottom of the page, 2.1 million. A lowball figure, the kind that would make any competent real estate agent go pale. I was surrendering $700,000 in equity on the spot, a 25% loss. In my former life as a CFO, I would have shown the door to anyone who put a deal like that on my desk. But today I wasn't shopping for profit. I was shopping for speed. I was acquiring a weapon, and weapons cost what they cost. I studied Mr. Duval. He was watching me tapping a gold pen against his chin, waiting for me to push back. He assumed I was in trouble, over-leveraged, desperate. He had no idea he was sitting across from a man who was simply finished waiting. "The price is acceptable," I said, my voice level. Duval stopped tapping. He blinked. Just like that. "You realize the market is strong, Mr. Hargrove. You could do considerably better with a proper listing." "I don't have time for open houses," I replied. "No time for inspections or mortgage contingencies. I need the funds wired to my offshore account by tomorrow morning, and the title transferred at once. There is one condition." Duval leaned forward. "There's always a catch." "What is it?" "Foundation issues mold. The house is immaculate," I said. "I had a new slate roof installed last year. The condition is straightforward. I need a lease back for exactly 7 days. I'll pay the week's rent. But on the 8th day at 9 a.m. sharp, you take possession. You change the locks. You bring an eviction crew if it comes to that." Duval smiled, the predatory kind, too many teeth showing. "We can accommodate that. We're experienced with sensitive exits. But what about the other residents? Public records show you're married. Does your wife know you're selling the roof over her head for 70 cents on the dollar?" I reached into my briefcase and placed on the table the document that was the cornerstone of this entire operation. Not the deed, something far more personal, a post-nuptial agreement dated 5 years ago. I slid it across to him. "My wife holds no claim to this property," I said. This was the card Diane had conveniently forgotten she'd signed. 5 years ago, she had developed a secret of her own, a gambling habit. It began with bingo, graduated to slot machines, and eventually found her in the high-stakes rooms of Joliet. I discovered the extent of it when a man with a broken nose appeared at my office and demanded $150,000 that Diane had borrowed against her jewelry. She was terrified. She was on the floor of our living room, weeping, swearing she would never touch a card or a chip again. I stepped in. I cleared the debt. I made the problem disappear. But I am a businessman. I don't extend capital without securing collateral. I told her I would absorb her mistakes, but she would sign a post-nuptial agreement in return. It stated plainly that in exchange for my financial intervention, she relinquished all rights to my premarital assets, specifically the Winnetka estate and my retirement accounts. She signed it without ever glancing at the text. She was so desperate to outrun the wreckage of her gambling that she would have put her name on anything. She probably assumed I'd never pull the trigger, probably figured I was too soft, too lovesick, too spineless to enforce a legal instrument against the woman sharing my bed. She was wrong. Mr. Duval worked through the legal pages methodically. He found the waiver clause and let out a slow, impressed whistle. "Ironclad," he said. "You really tied her hands." "I didn't tie her hands," I said, taking the document back. "I just refused to be the one who went down with the ship." I picked up the pen. The ink moved smoothly across the paper. Victor Hargrove. I signed my name 3 times. With each signature, I felt the weight of the house lift from my shoulders. The heated pool. The home theater I never once used. The wine cellar Dean was currently ransacking. All of it gone. Nothing but bricks and mortar now. I stood and shook Duval's hand. His palm was damp. "Wire the funds," I said, "and have your crew ready for Monday morning. I'll leave the keys in the lockbox." When I drove back to the house, it was late afternoon. The sun was throwing long shadows across the lawn, making the white pillars look like the bars of a gilded cage. I pulled into the driveway and found Diane standing at the front door. She was holding fabric swatches up against the exterior brickwork. She waved, smiling. She looked happy, safe, untouchable. "Victor," she called as I climbed out of the car. "I was thinking, since we're already spending so much on the wedding, maybe next month we repaint the exterior. This white is going a bit dingy. I'm thinking a soft cream. It would look so refined." I walked up the steps. I looked at the house that now belonged to a private equity firm. I looked at the woman planning renovations on a property she'd been evicted from hours earlier. "Cream sounds lovely," I said. She slipped her arm through mine, and Brittany was saying we should eventually convert your study into a nursery. "You know, for when she and Cody decide to start a family. You don't really use it that much anyway, do you? You could always move your desk to the basement." The basement. They wanted to put me in the basement of a house I had just sold. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I held the front door open for her. "After you," I said. We walked into the foyer. Dean was there naturally, stretched out across the silk sofa, feet propped on the coffee table, wearing my slippers. He cracked one eye open as we came in. "Hey, Vic," he grunted. "We're out of ice. Be a pal and grab a bag from the store." I looked at him. I looked at the ring of water damage his glass was leaving on the antique table. Any normal man would have exploded. Any normal man would have thrown him out on the spot. But I was deep in the endgame now. Every insult was just fuel. Every slight was simply confirmation that what I'd done at that diner was exactly right. "Sure, Dean," I said. "I'll get the ice." I went to the kitchen, but I did not get ice. I went straight to the calendar on the refrigerator. Diane had marked the wedding date in red heart stickers. I pulled a black marker from the drawer. I drew a small, inconspicuous X on the Monday after the wedding. "What's that?" Brittany asked, walking in with a glass of wine. "What's happening on Monday?" I capped the marker. "Just a deadline," I said. "A business deadline. Nothing you need to worry about." She rolled her eyes. "You're always working, Victor. You need to learn to live a little. Take a lesson from Dean. That man knows how to relax." I smiled at my stepdaughter, the girl whose tuition I'd paid, the girl whose car insurance I'd covered, the girl who was about to receive the most brutal education of her life. "You're right, Brittany," I said quietly. "I'm going to start learning how to relax very soon." I walked out of the kitchen and left them to their wine and their comfortable illusions. I had 7 days left in this house. 7 days to pack my life into boxes while they threw a party. 7 days to watch them stroll toward the edge of the cliff, grinning all the way. I went upstairs to my study, the room they wanted to turn into a nursery, and shut the door. I settled into the chair and listened to the quiet. It wasn't the quiet of loneliness anymore. It was the quiet of a countdown and that clock was ticking loud and clear. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The house was sold. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the snap. The clock on the study wall ticked past 4 in the afternoon. Sunlight was beginning to angle through the blinds, slicing the room into bands of light and shadow. I sat in my leather chair, the one I'd bought after my first major promotion 20 years ago, and I waited. The house was quiet, but it was a deceptive quiet. The silence of a sprung trap coiled and ready. On the desk before me lay the charcoal Brioni suit, freshly dry-cleaned, sealed in plastic, looking like a body bag for a ghost. I heard the front door swing open without a knock. That was Dean. He never knocked anymore. Since Friday, since the moment Brittany had crowned him father of the bride, he'd been walking into my home as though he held the deed. I heard his heavy footfall on the hardwood, the scuff of cheap rubber soles against expensive oak planks. He was whistling, a tune I didn't recognize, but it had an arrogant sound to it. "Hey, Vic," he called out. His voice bounced off the hallway walls. "You in the dungeon?" I didn't answer. I just watched the door. A moment later, Dean filled the frame. Disheveled as always, hair thinning, combed over in a valiant attempt to disguise the scalp face carrying the deep flush of a man who drank his breakfast. He had on jeans that were a size too small and a faded t-shirt that read Legend across the chest. The irony was almost more than I could bear. "There he is," Dean said, grinning wide. He stepped into the room and swept his eyes around it. "Ja, man, I love this room. Smells like money, like old books and gravitas. You know, when I move in for a few weeks after you two head out on that trip, I think I'm going to set up my command center in here. Maybe put a mini fridge right there by the window." He pointed to the exact spot where my limited edition globe stood. I said nothing. I simply gestured toward the suit on the desk. "It's ready for you, Dean," I said. He walked over and dragged his hand across the plastic. "Nice," he whistled. "Italian wool." "The finest," I said. He tore the plastic open with a roughness that made me flinch inwardly. He pulled the jacket free of the hanger and held it up. He slid his arms in. It fit well, unfortunately. We were roughly the same height, though he carried his weight in his stomach, while I carried mine in my chest. He buttoned it, struggling at the middle button, sucking in his gut, until the fabric pulled taut. He turned toward the corner mirror. He preened. He adjusted the lapels. He regarded himself as though he were chairman of the universe. "Damn," he said softly. "I clean up good. Look at that, Vic. You can throw a suit on a jagged rock and make it look smooth, huh?" "You look appropriate," I said. "Brittany will be pleased." Dean turned to face me, leaning back against my desk. He crossed his arms, the suit fabric stretching across his back. "You know, Vic," he said, his tone sliding from vanity into something sharper, something uglier. "I've got to hand it to you. You're taking all of this a lot better than I expected." I held his gaze. "I'm a pragmatist, Dean. Brittany wants her father." "Who am I to stand between a girl and her biology?" Dean laughed. A wet, hacking sound. "Biology. Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? You can buy them the houses. You can buy them the cars. You can pay for the fancy degrees. But when it's all said and done, blood calls to blood. You're just the resource. I'm the source." He picked a crystal paperweight off my desk and began tossing it idly in the air. "Di and I were talking last night," he went on, watching the glass spin. "She's worried about you. Thinks you're getting too old for a house this size. All these stairs, the upkeep. It's a lot for a man in his twilight years." I stayed perfectly still. "Is that so?" "Yeah," Dean said. "We were thinking maybe after the wedding it's time for a change. Sell this place. Use the cash to set yourself up in a nice little condo in Arizona. something with a nurse on call. And then, well, the rest of the equity could really give Brittany and Cody a solid start. And Di deserves to have some fun. Don't you think? She's spent 15 years looking after you, looking after me. The woman who hadn't cooked a meal in a decade. The woman whose gambling debts I had wiped clean. That is an interesting plan, I said evenly. Dean smirked. He set the paperweight down. Look, Vic, don't make this difficult. You had a good run. You got to play family man. But now the real man is back. I'm going to be around a lot more holidays, birthdays, Sundays. It's going to be uncomfortable for you. We're just trying to give you a graceful exit. He was evicting me from my own study wearing my own suit. The man who had abandoned his daughter was standing there telling me it was time to clear out so he could pick the bones of my life clean. I stood up. I crossed the room toward him. For just a moment I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. He remembered I was a Marine before I was an accountant. He remembered I knew how to break things. But I did not raise my fist. I reached out and straightened the lapel of his jacket. You're right, Dean, I said quietly. I've been thinking the same thing. A change is long overdue. I slipped a hand into my pocket. Here, I said. You'll need a pocket square to finish the look. I produced a folded white silk handkerchief, but deep within its folds, hidden inside the layers of fabric, sat a device no larger than a stick of gum. It was a high-fidelity digital recorder, the kind I used to carry into board meetings. It was already running. 48 hours of battery life and enough memory to capture a week's worth of conversation. I tucked the handkerchief into the breast pocket of the suit. I pressed it in gently. Perfect, I said. Dean glanced down at the pocket. Thanks, Vic. You really are a servant at heart, aren't you? Always catering to the better man. He laughed and turned back to the mirror. I'm keeping this on, he said. Break it in a little. I'm heading out to meet Cody for drinks. We've got some celebrating to do. By all means, I said. Enjoy the evening. Dean strutted toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Hey, Vic. Yes, don't wait up, he sneered. I waited until the front door clicked shut. I waited until the engine of his rusted truck coughed to life and faded away down the driveway. I moved to the window. I watched the dust settle. He was wearing the wire. He was walking into a bar to meet the other leech Cody. Alcohol loosens tongues. Arrogance loosens them even faster. Right there in that pocket next to his beating heart was everything I needed to bury them all. He would boast about the scheme. He would laugh about how they were working me. He would confess to the coercion, and the judge would hear every word of it. I turned back to my desk. The plastic wrap from the suit was still there, crumpled like a shed skin. I picked it up and dropped it in the trash. The anger was gone. That season had passed. What I felt now was the cold, clean precision of a man in execution mode. I looked at the empty hangar. It swayed faintly in the drift from the air conditioner. Wear it in good health, Dean, I whispered to the empty room, because it is the last suit you will ever wear as a free man. I sat down and opened my laptop, one final transfer to make. I logged into the trust account, the one I had established for Brittany's future children. The balance stood at $200,000. I clicked on the tab marked Beneficiaries. I highlighted Brittany's name. I pressed the backspace key. The name disappeared. I typed in a new one, the Wounded Warrior Project. I clicked Confirm. The screen flashed green. Transaction successful. I shut the laptop. The sun had gone down. The room had gone dark. But for the first time in 15 years, I could see everything with perfect clarity. Tomorrow was Monday. The movers were coming. The locks were being changed. And somewhere in a bar downtown, Dean was busy recording his own confession. Let the games begin. Tuesday morning came, wearing the kind of deceptive sunshine that usually rolls in ahead of a hurricane. The house hummed with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with vanity. Brittany was pacing the kitchen, complaining about the dark circles under her eyes, insisting the wedding stress was destroying her complexion. Diane was right behind her, nodding along sympathetically, casting glances at me, as though I were personally responsible for their exhaustion. This was the moment, the final dose of anesthesia before the surgery. I drew 2 envelopes from my jacket pocket. They were thick, heavy cardstock, the kind that whispers luxury before you've even broken the seal. I laid them on the marble island beside Brittany's untouched green juice. I think you both need a break, I said, keeping my voice warm. You've been pushing yourselves so hard to make this wedding perfect. I've booked you 2 nights at Eagle Ridge Resort and Spa in the Galena territory. The full package. Massages, facials, mud baths. You leave in an hour. Brittany stopped mid-pace. Her eyes went wide. She tore open the envelope. Eagle Ridge. Victor, this place is impossible to get into. It runs like $2,000 a night. I smiled. I pulled some strings. You need to be glowing for the photos on Saturday. Go. Relax. Don't worry about the house. Don't give the vendors a second thought. I'll manage everything here. Diane looked at me with tears rising in her eyes. Real tears, for once. She came around the counter and pulled me into a hug. The scent of her expensive perfume purchased with my bonus check the previous year filled my nose. You are the best husband, she whispered. I don't know what I would do without you. You'll find out soon enough, I thought. Go pack, I said gently, stepping back. The car service arrives at 10:00. For the next hour, I watched them scramble. They packed as if they were heading to Fashion Week, stuffing Louis Vuitton duffels with silk robes and designer swimwear. They were giddy. They were laughing. They were already mentally untethered from reality. At $10 sharp, a black Cadillac Escalade rolled up the driveway. The driver loaded their bags. Brittany blew me a kiss from the back seat. Bye, Dad. You're the best. It was the first time in 10 years she had called me Dad without a money request attached to it. It was also the last time she ever would. I waved until the car swung around the corner and vanished behind the hedgerow. The instant those taillights disappeared, the smile fell from my face like a dropped curtain. I turned back toward the house. The silence was total. It was 10:05 a.m. I pulled out my phone and dialed Titan Logistics. You are clear to approach, I said. They must have been idling around the block, because 3 minutes later, 2 massive 18-wheelers rolled up the driveway. These were not ordinary movers. These were white-glove relocation specialists, the kind retained by museums and billionaires. Their uniforms were cleaner than Dean's best shirt. The foreman, a man named Bowen, walked up to me with a tablet. Mr. Hargrove, he said, we have the inventory list. We're prioritizing high-value assets and personal property. Correct, I said. I want to be very precise about this. If I bought it, it goes. If she bought it, or if it's cheap laminate, it stays. I want the contrast to be unmistakable. Bowen nodded. We'll have the ground floor cleared in 3 hours. I stood in the foyer and directed traffic. It was a surgical extraction. I watched them swaddle the grand piano in protective padding. That piano cost $65,000. Diane didn't play. She used it purely as a shelf for framed photos of herself. Take it, I said. They moved into the living room. The Persian rugs were rolled up, exposing the bare hardwood beneath. The EMS lounge chair, my favorite reading spot, was carried out. The 85-inch OLED television was unmounted from the wall, leaving a stark, rectangular ghost of dust where it had hung. I walked into the kitchen. This was the hardest part, but also the most essential. I opened the wine cellar. There were 250 bottles of vintage wine, Bordeaux, Napa, Cabernets, rare scotches. Dean had already made a dent in the collection, but the real value was intact. "Pack it all," I said. "Leave the 2 bottles of grocery store Chardonnay on the bottom rack." Why, one of the movers asked, puzzled. "So they have something to drink when they realize their lives are over," I said. By 2:00 p.m., the house had been transformed. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a warehouse in the final stages of liquidation. In the dining room, the solid mahogany table that seated 12 had vanished. In its place, I left the folding card table Diane had dragged into the marriage 15 years ago. It sat there wobbly and scarred, looking utterly forlorn in the center of that grand room. In the living room, the Italian leather sofas were loaded in the truck. All that remained were a few velvet poufs Brittany had ordered from some online discount site, and a beanbag chair that smelled like dog. I went upstairs to the master bedroom. I stripped the bed. The Egyptian cotton sheets, the down comforter, the memory foam mattress, all mine. All purchased with the sweat of a 40-year career. I had the movers take the mattress. I left the box spring. It felt petty, but then I recalled the conversation about relocating me to the basement. Petty was simply a matter of perspective. I went into the closet. My side was already bare. I looked at Diane's side. Rows of designer dresses, shoes, handbags, tens of thousands of dollars in merchandise. I did not touch a thread of it. Let her keep her costumes. She would need them to maintain the fiction of wealth when she was standing in the unemployment line. The last items to go were the paintings. The hallway had been lined with original oils coastal landscapes I had gathered over decades. As the movers lifted them from the walls, the plaster looked exposed and raw. The hooks stayed behind, jutting out like small metal accusations. At 6:00 p.m., both trucks were full. The foreman held out the tablet for my signature. "We're heading to the storage facility in Indiana," he said. "You're all set, Mr. Hargrove." I stood in the foyer and listened. The echo was striking. My footsteps rang out sharply against the floor. The house felt cold, now stripped of the insulation that wealth provides. Just a structure rooms linked by drywall and plumbing. I walked through the kitchen one last time. It was the only room with light, as I had arranged for the electric company to cut power to the rest of the house the following day. I set the envelope on the counter, the one containing the eviction notice and the cancellation receipts. I pulled up the single metal folding chair I had kept back from the garage. I positioned it facing the envelope. I sat for a moment. I closed my eyes. I searched for guilt. I searched for sadness for the woman I had once loved, but all I could see was the text on her phone to Dean, laughing about my stupidity. All I could hear was Brittany telling me I was just Victor. I stood up. I was no longer Victor the husband. I was no longer Victor the stepdad. I was Victor the ghost. I walked out the back door and locked it behind me. I went to the front door and keyed in the code on the lockbox one final time. I dropped the heavy brass key inside. It landed with a metallic clink that sounded like a gavel striking a block. Case closed. I got into my car. The sun was setting, pulling long, dying shadows across the lawn. I did not look back at the empty windows. I put the car in drive and headed for the airport. I had a one-way ticket to Tuscany in my pocket. They had 2 days of massages and cucumber water ahead of them. 2 days of bliss, and then they would come home to the void they had created. I was already 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, sipping warm whiskey in economy class, when the Cadillac Escalade turned back into the driveway of the Winnetka estate. I can picture the scene with absolute clarity, not because I was there, but because I had spent 15 years studying the habits of these 2 women. I knew precisely how this tragedy would unfold, beat by beat. scream by scream. It was Wednesday afternoon. Diane and Brittany were stepping out of the car, their skin luminous from 2 days of exfoliation and seaweed wraps that cost more than my first car. They were laughing. Brittany was probably checking her phone, waiting on final confirmation from the florist about the orchid archway. Diane was likely instructing the driver to carry the bags to the foyer, expecting to tip him from the emergency jar I kept in the kitchen. They were drifting on a cloud of entitlement, completely blind to the fact that the ground beneath them had been incinerated. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. The house usually hummed the pool filter. The air conditioning, the landscape lighting, all generated a low, expensive ambient noise. But today, the house was dark. The upstairs curtains were gone, leaving the windows looking like hollow black eyes staring back at them. Diane climbed the front steps, first her heels clicking on the stone. She reached for the front door handle. It was locked. She frowned. She punched her code into the smart lock. Her birthday. The keypad flashed red. She tried again. Perhaps she had mistyped. She pressed each digit more deliberately. Red. Denied. I can imagine the confusion beginning to curdle into irritation. She probably called out my name, assuming I was inside playing some kind of joke or had accidentally engaged the deadlock. Victor opened the door. The code isn't working. Brittany came up behind her Starbucks cup in hand. Move, Mom. You probably hit the wrong button. Brittany entered her own code. The day she graduated high school. Denied. This was the moment irritation sharpened into a cold spike of fear. Because it wasn't only that the door refused to open, it was the sound. When you knock on a door in a furnished house, the sound is absorbed. When you bang on a door in an empty house, it echoes back. Hollow. Like a drum. Brittany stepped off the porch and moved to the large bay window of the living room. She cupped her hands against the glass to cut the afternoon glare. She peered inside. I wish I could have seen her face in that moment. I wish I could have watched her brain attempt to process what her eyes were sending it. The living room was gone. The white sofas were gone. The 85-inch television was gone. The rugs were gone. There was nothing but a wide expanse of hardwood floor dissolving into shadow. Mom, she whispered. The house, it's empty. Diane ran to the window. She gasped and dropped her purse. Her hands clawed at the glass like a bird caught inside a room. We've been robbed, she screamed. Oh my God, Victor, where is Victor? Call 911. We've been robbed. They didn't understand. A robber takes the television and the jewelry. A robber doesn't take the curtains. A robber doesn't haul away the solid oak dining table. Panic makes people irrational. They ran around to the back of the house. They tried the patio doors. Locked. They tried the kitchen window. Locked. Finally, Brittany remembered the spare key hidden in the fake rock near the garden hose, the one I had warned them about a dozen times for being insecure. The one I had left there deliberately for this exact moment because I wanted them inside. I wanted them to experience the full acoustic horror of that echo. Brittany smashed the fake rock against the patio pavers to pop the plastic cover off. She jammed the key into the back door. It turned. They burst into the kitchen, breathless, braced to confront intruders. Hello, is anyone here? Diane screamed, snatching up a heavy brass candlestick holder the movers had left behind because it was broken. Silence answered them. A heavy, dusty silence. They moved through the kitchen. It was unrecognizable. The counters were bare. The coffee maker, the toaster, the mixer, all gone. The refrigerator door hung slightly ajar, revealing dark, empty shelves. The only light came from the afternoon sun cutting through the bare windows, catching the dust motes drifting in the air. And then they saw it. In the center of the kitchen, in the middle of the vast empty space where the island had stood, crowded with bar stools and fruit bowls, sat a single metal folding chair. It faced the granite countertop. On the counter lay a thick manila envelope. It looked like an altar, a shrine to the end of their world. They approached it slowly. The click of their heels was deafening in the stripped room. Diane reached the envelope first. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely work the clasp. She pulled out the documents. The first page was the closing statement from the sale of the property. Hold on before we go any further, because what is coming next is the moment the ground shifts completely beneath everyone who thought they had won. The price of betrayal is about to be named, and it is steeper than any of them imagined. Tell me this, if someone you had given everything to was quietly working to leave you with nothing, would you let them see it coming, or would you move in total silence? To Diane, that standard real estate form might as well have been a death certificate. Sale date yesterday. Vacate deadline today at 5:00 p.m. Seller Victor Hargrove. Net proceeds forwarded to an account neither of them had ever laid eyes on. Sold. The word came out of her mouth like something she was choking on. He actually sold it. Brittany lunged for the second stack of papers. Colorful pages. Wedding vendor receipts. Florist canceled. Refund processed to cardholder. Caterer canceled. Refund processed to cardholder. Venue canceled. Deposit forfeited. Band canceled. Every orchid, every lobster tail, every curated detail of the life she had been constructing, gone. No. Brittany let out a low, wounded sound. Her knees buckled and she caught herself on the counter's edge. No, no, no. 4 days. 4 days until the wedding. He can't just do this. But the envelope still had one more thing inside. A handwritten note. My personal stationery. Calm handwriting from a calm man at that very counter 2 days prior. Diane read it aloud, her voice splintering as she went. Dear Diane and Brittany, you were very clear about what you wanted a wedding presided over by the father of the bride. You established that Dean holds that title, and I hold the checkbook. I have chosen to honor your distinction. I have extracted myself and my finances from this arrangement entirely. The house changed hands yesterday. The new owners assume possession at 5:00 p.m. today. Your presence here is trespassing. Every vendor contract bore my name. Since I am not the father, those contracts are void. Dean, as the acknowledged father, is welcome to reinstate them. Their contact information is attached. I trust he'll be glad to offer his payment details. Don't try to find me. I'm not there. Don't try to find the money. That's not there either. Victor, the sound that erupted from Brittany's throat, had nothing to do with grief. It was pure animal fury, the howl of something that had just had its lifeline severed. She swept both arms across the counter and sent the papers cascading to the floor. He destroyed it. He destroyed my entire life, she screamed, driving her foot into the folding chair. It skidded and spun across the bare kitchen floor. Diane crumpled against the cabinet face and sank to the ground. She sat in the wreckage of the documents, staring around at the gutted shell of what she had believed was her domain. Her eyes found the wall where her portrait had spent years presiding over the room, a blank white rectangle. That was all that remained. Victor, Diane whimpered. Where are we supposed to sleep? The question drifted up the empty staircase off the naked walls of the stripped bedrooms and dissolved into the silence I had engineered. Then the front door banged open. Heavy, lumbering footsteps landed in the foyer. Dean, arriving right on schedule, no doubt angling for a cold drink and somewhere to put his feet up. Hey, he called out. What happened to the TV, you guys redecorating or something? Brittany started laughing, high-pitched. Wrong. The sound a person makes when sanity is negotiable. "Welcome home, Dad!" she screamed toward the ceiling. "Welcome home!" What broke the silence next wasn't a voice. It was a buzz. Brittany's phone face up on the bare granite, vibrating like a small alarm. Then Diane's lit up. Then Cody's. He had just materialized through the back door and stood frozen in the threshold, taking in the emptiness around him. Notification after notification. A digital execution perfectly choreographed. I had set the cancellation emails to detonate at exactly 5:00. Standard corporate practice 5:00. On a Wednesday means the damage lands when no one can act on it until morning. Except for these 4 morning was never coming. Brittany got to her phone, first hands shaking so badly, the screen nearly slipped from her grip. An email from the caterer, the same company they had upgraded with just last week to add lobster and filet mignon to the menu. Subject line, all capitals, urgent cancellation and outstanding balance. She read it aloud. Her voice thin and reedy like a child calling out in an empty store. "Dear Ms. Caldwell, this is to inform you that Mr. Hargrove has withdrawn a financial sponsorship of your event effective immediately. As stipulated in the agreement executed by you and Mr. Cody Felton, full payment is owed upon cancellation within 72 hours of the scheduled event." She stopped. She swallowed. Read the number Cody said from the doorway, his voice stripped of warmth. His face had gone the color of old ash. He had already calculated what was coming. Brittany forced it out. $42.580. Full charge because the food is already sourced. Wire the balance by noon tomorrow, or they pursue collections and file for breach of contract. 40 grand. Dean made a sound halfway between a laugh and a cough, cracking his knuckle. "That's obviously an error. Just get Vic on the phone. Tell him the joke's over. He is not joking." Brittany spun and faced him, her voice cracking through the room like a whip. "He is gone. The house is sold. The accounts are empty. Gone. Do you understand what gone means?" The echo of her voice had barely faded when the next alert landed. The florist, the one who had sworn on her professional life she could deliver Vogue cover orchids. Brittany stared at the message. "Renata says the flowers were already flown in from Thailand. Non-refundable. She's processing the remaining $15,000 against the card on file." The card on file. Every head in the room swiveled to Cody. His card. The one his parents had co-signed as a favor. The one he used to produce with such easy confidence whenever he expected me to square the tab afterward. Cody's thumbs were already flying across his phone, punching into his banking app. I don't need to have been there to know what he saw. Every vendor moving simultaneously, the venue, the florist, the band, the lighting company, all racing to collect before the well ran completely dry. "No." Cody's voice dropped to almost nothing. "No, no, no. That is my parents' money. That is our down payment." He raised his eyes to Brittany's face, and whatever feeling had lived there before, the warmth, the devotion, the plan, it was gone. In its place was something colder. The face of a man reviewing a bad contract. "You promised me he would cover it," Cody said, low and deliberate. "You were standing right there in that flower shop telling me to swipe because Victor never lets anything fall through. You called him a sure thing. I believed you." Brittany was crying openly now, mascara tracing dark channels down the fresh skin of her just-completed facial. "He has always covered it. Every single time. I don't know what made this different." "You know exactly what made it different," Diane murmured from her spot on the floor, still hugging her knees, still rocking. "The suit, the invitation, telling him his place in this family." "You went too far, Brittany. I warned you about the father of the bride business. Don't you dare lecture me, Mom. Brittany's voice went razor sharp. You were right there laughing with me. You were the one who said we could show him the door the minute the honeymoon was over. Cody moved deeper into the kitchen. He looked at the gaping hole where the refrigerator had stood. He looked at Dean motionless in his dirty t-shirt radiating nothing useful. He looked at Brittany, no longer a bride-to-be with a wealthy stepfather behind her, just a woman drowning in obligations. My credit score. Cody's voice climbed toward something sharp and dangerous. Do you have any concept of what this does to my credit score? My father is going to be out of his mind. That card was co-signed for genuine emergencies. This is an emergency, Brittany said, stepping toward him, hand outstretched. Cody, we can still fix this. Together we can figure. Cody moved back. One step, decisive, as if contact might transfer the damage. There is no together anymore, Brittany. I came into this expecting to marry a Hargrove. I factored in the Winnetka address, the trust, the whole structure. Nobody sold me on marrying his daughter. He jabbed a finger at Dean. Dean squared up, reaching for something like authority. Mind how you speak, son? That is my daughter. Sure. Cody's lip curled. Then be her father. Right now. Tonight. Write the check, $57,000 for the catering bill and the flowers that are already dead in transit. You're the father of the bride. It says so right on the invitation. Mr. Dean Colwell, go on. I'll wait. Silence descended over the room like a physical weight. Everyone already knew. Dean didn't have $50,000. Dean didn't have 50 children to his name that wasn't already spoken for. There was the truck with the failing transmission. There was the bar tab. Cody's laugh came out flat and merciless. Yeah, that's the whole story, isn't it? Every last one of you parasites playing aristocrat on someone else's tab. You had nothing. You are nothing. He turned and walked toward the door. Cody, stop! Brittany screamed, scrambling after him. Cody, the wedding is in 4 days. Well, what am I supposed to tell everyone? Tell them the groom came to his senses, Cody said without looking back. He walked out the door, dropped into his leased BMW, and peeled out of the driveway. Brittany stood in the doorway watching the taillights shrink and vanish just as I had done hours before, but I had departed with my dignity intact. She was left holding a cancellation fee. She turned back to face the kitchen. Diane was sobbing quietly in the corner. Dean was pawing through the bare cupboards, hunting for any bottle the movers might have overlooked. Brittany looked at her phone again. Another message had arrived. This one from the wedding planner. Dear Brittany, due to non-payment of the final installment, we are releasing your date to another couple currently on the waiting list. Please be advised that your deposit is non-refundable. She folded at the doorframe, sliding down until she met the floor. She buried her face in both hands. Victor. She whimpered into the dark hollow of that empty house. Daddy, please pick up. But the phone she was calling had been dropped in a trash bin somewhere in the airport terminal, and the man she was trying to reach was at that moment ordering a glass of Chianti 4,000 miles away, savoring the quiet he had earned. I had checked into a suite at the Peninsula Chicago, killing time before my evening flight to Rome. It was a pristine, beautiful room that carried the scent of starch and expensive lilies, a relief after the gutted shell of the Winnetka house. I poured myself a glass of still water and opened my iPad. My phone was on silent, but I understood perfectly well that the storm was in full force. I just didn't know the wind speed until I pulled up Instagram. Years ago, I had set up a secondary account for the sole purpose of monitoring Brittany's spending. She had a habit of posting her unauthorized purchases before the credit card statement even generated. Today, her profile wasn't showcasing handbags or avocado toast. It was showcasing a collapse. She had gone live. The notification read 40,000 viewers. I tapped into the feed. Brittany was on the floor of the exact kitchen I had vacated that afternoon. She had assembled her ring light because even at the bottom of her world presentation remained non-negotiable. She was in a hoodie. I recognized it immediately, an old Northwestern University sweatshirt she had never once touched before tonight. Her makeup was mostly gone, enough mascara smudged beneath her eyes to imply hours of crying, but not enough to make her look anything less than photogenic. "Hey guys," she said quietly, her voice carrying a practiced crack. "I really didn't want to film this. I didn't, but I have nowhere else to turn." She let that hang in the air, dropping her gaze to her hands. The comments were firing so fast. The scroll was a solid blur of broken hearts and fury emojis. My stepfather, Victor. The man I have called Dad for 15 years. She looked straight into the lens, and despite everything I had, to acknowledge the craft. It was a flawless performance. He walked away from us. She continued, a single tear moving down her cheek with impeccable timing. He sold the house without a word of warning. He canceled my wedding with 4 days to go. He drained the accounts. And the reason, he was jealous. I took a sip of still water. Jealous. That was her chosen angle. He was jealous because I reached back out to my biological father, Dean. She broke into a sob. Dean has been working so hard to rebuild our relationship, and Victor simply couldn't tolerate not being the one in the spotlight. He told me that if I let Dean walk me down the aisle, he would make sure I had nothing. I assumed he was venting. I never believed he would actually leave my mother and me without a roof. The audacity of it nearly knocked the breath out of me. With surgical precision, she had stripped out every act of cruelty on her part, sutured the story back together, and cast me as the villain. No mention of the demand for the Brioni suit. No mention of just Victor. No mention of the debts she and Cody had generated entirely on their own. I watched the comments churn. That online horde, the outrage engine that never sleeps, was fully ignited. What a psycho. This is financial abuse. Find out where he is. Someone needs to make this man answer for it. Brittany dragged her sleeve across her nose. "I don't care about losing the money," she lied without blinking. "I just care that he shattered my trust. I feel completely unsafe right now. We're going to be sleeping on the floor tonight. If anyone happens to see him, please just tell him we're sorry for whatever we did that made him this angry. We just want him to come home." It was a clinic in manipulation. She wasn't soliciting donations outright. She was mobilizing a crowd. She was sketching a target on my back while holding the brush. I closed the iPad. Not angry, just cold, detached. Satisfied in the specific way that comes when your opponent reveals their hand too early. In her urgency to ruin me, she had committed a catastrophic strategic error. She had gone public. She had filed her lies in front of 40,000 witnesses. In a courtroom, a private conversation is hearsay. A live stream with 40,000 viewers is a sworn affidavit. She had just delivered my attorney the foundation of a defamation case that could attach itself to her earnings for the rest of her working life. But the internet does not wait for court dates. I needed to return the rental car ahead of my flight. I had deliberately rented an unremarkable sedan to stay below the radar, but I had miscalculated one variable. My face was now living on every phone in the area. Brittany had posted a photograph of me in the next slide, a shot from last Christmas where I looked severe and unsmiling, perfectly calibrated to fit her narrative of the cold-blooded tyrant. I rode the elevator down to the parking garage. The valet brought the car to the curb. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me before. He held the keys out, then hesitated, keeping them a beat too long. You look like that guy, he said, eyes narrowing. The one going around on TikTok. The dad who canceled the wedding. I lifted the keys from his fingers. Common face, I said with complete composure. I climbed in and pulled out onto the street. I was a few blocks from the hotel when a red light caught me at an intersection. The sidewalks were thick with people, necks bent over their phones. A cluster of teenagers occupied the corner. One of them glanced up. He pointed, shouted something to the others. They looked at their screens, then at my car. The recognition that moved across their faces was not admiration. "That's him," the kid yelled. "That's the deadbeat." I fixed my eyes on the light. Still red. One of them was holding a large cup, a red slushie or a thick smoothie. He charged into the street. For Brittany, he hollered and launched it at the car. It detonated against the driver's window. Red liquid sheeted across the glass and ran down in slow, dramatic streaks. It swallowed the side mirror from view. His friends erupted. Phones were up immediately, capturing their act of chivalry, assaulting a man in a sedan because a young woman performed grief on the internet. I did not lower the window. I did not shout. I did not get out. That was the footage they were after. The furious tyrant snapping under pressure. The clip that would confirm everything Brittany had told them. The light went green. I activated the wipers. The blades dragged the red slush across the windshield in a wide smear before carving out a narrow arc of visibility. I pressed the pedal and moved through the intersection. Steady pulse, steady hands. In the rearview mirror, the kids were celebrating, convinced they had put me in my place, convinced they had shamed me into something. I drove the remaining distance to the airport with that red stain drying on the door panel. Horns. Stairs. I was a marked man in a city I had spent decades helping to build. When I steered into the rental return lane, the attendant circled the vehicle and stopped short at the passenger side. "What in the world happened here?" he asked, wincing. "A misunderstanding," I said. I surrendered the keys, put the cleaning charge on the card without discussion. I took my bag and moved toward the terminal. I could feel the weight of eyes tracking me. I kept my chin level. Let them look. Let them build their story. They were watching a film, and they had missed the entire first act. The ending was going to surprise them. I located a quiet seat in the first-class lounge and placed a call to Clive Pemberton. "Did you see it?" Clive asked. His voice was gravelly, as though he was suppressing either a cough or a laugh. "I saw it." "What?" I said. "And I saw what they did to the car." "Excellent," Clive said. "That's assault and property damage incited by a public figure making false statements. We just added 2 zeros to the countersuit." "Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm boarding in an hour," I said. "Clive, I need you to preserve that video. Download it. Save the comments. Save the threats." "Way ahead of you, Victor," Clive replied. "She is digging her own grave with a ring light. By the way, the florist phoned my office. She is threatening to sue you for fraud." "Let her," I said. "The contract is in Cody's name. I am just a third party who decided not to give a gift. There is no law against being a disappointing stepfather." Clive laughed. "You are a cold son of a gun, Hargrove. Enjoy Italy. When you touch down, I will have the draft of the restraining order ready for your review." I ended the call. I gazed out the window at the runway. The sun was going down, throwing long shadows across the tarmac. I was leaving the chaos in my wake. I was leaving the red paint and the screaming teenagers and the weeping influencer. I opened my iPad one final time. I pulled up Brittany's profile. The video had run its course. She had posted a story update, a selfie, her and Diane holding candles in the darkened kitchen. The caption read, "The darkness is scary, but our love is brighter. Survivor, justice for Brittany." I scrolled through the comments. Deep in the flood of support, I spotted a post from a user called Dean the Legend. "Don't worry, baby girl. Daddy is here. We will make him pay." I smiled. Dean had swallowed the bait whole. He was stepping into the role of protector, provider, hero, stepping straight into the bear trap. I switched off the iPad. I made my way to the gate. The flight attendant scanned my boarding pass. "Have the pleasant flight, Mr. Hargrove," she said. I looked at her. For the first time in days, I felt the tension drain from my face into something genuine. "Oh, I will," I said. "I really will." I walked down the jet bridge. I was leaving the country as the villain. I knew that when I came back, I would be the plaintiff. But for now, let them have their internet points. Let them have their viral moment. Because while they were fighting for likes, I was fighting for my life. And I had just won the most critical battle without throwing a single punch. The digital mob was howling for blood online, but I understood that virtual threats rarely stayed virtual, not for long, and certainly not when alcohol was in the mix. I had secured a modest, unremarkable townhouse on the city's outskirts, listed under a shell company no one could connect to Victor Hargrove. Or so I believed. But fury has a way of sharpening the mind, and Dean had likely spent those last few hours terrorizing my former neighbors until one of them, frightened and fed up, surrendered the license plate number of my rental car. It was just past midnight when I heard it. A truck engine roaring down the silent street, followed by the screech of tires jumping the curb. I was in the living room, sitting in the dark. I had been anticipating this. In fact, I was counting on it. I checked the app on my phone. The notification glowed green. System armed. Camera 1 recording. Camera 2 recording. I slipped the phone into my pocket and rose to my feet. I straightened the collar of my shirt. I positioned myself in the center of the room, squarely in the field of the wide-angle lens concealed in the bookshelf. I took a slow breath, letting air fill my lungs, letting my pulse settle. Then came the pounding, heavy, rhythmic blows against the front door that rattled the frame. "Open up, you coward!" Dean's voice was slurred, thick with cheap whiskey and misplaced righteousness. "Open the door, Vic. I know you are in there." I did not move. I did not call out. I simply waited. The pounding stopped for a moment, replaced by the crack of breaking glass. He had hurled a landscaping brick through the side window. A hand reached inside, groping for the lock. The door flew open with a crash, slamming the wall. Dean lurched into the foyer. He was a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot. His shirt was dark with sweat, and he swayed where he stood. He had a baseball bat in one hand, dragging its tip across the floorboards with a menacing scrape. "There you are!" he sneered, squinting into the dimness. "Sitting there like a king while my daughter cries her eyes out." He took a step toward me, lifting the bat. "You think you are tough, huh? You think you can just cut people off? You think money makes you a man?" I looked at him. I studied his sloppy stance, his unguarded chin, the way his weight sat entirely on his heels. Decades ago, before I wore suits and stared at spreadsheets, I wore a different uniform. I was a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I completed 2 tours overseas. I was trained in hand-to-hand combat by men who treated violence as a science. I knew exactly how to strip a bat from a man's grip. I knew how to shatter a kneecap with one kick. I knew how to put Dean on the floor and make sure he never walked without a limp again. My muscles coiled. The instinct to strike, to neutralize the threat, was nearly overpowering. It would have been effortless. It would have been deeply satisfying. but I kept my hands at my sides. I forced my body to stay loose. If I fought back, it was a brawl, a dispute between two men, mutual combat. But if I held still, if I let him assault an unarmed senior citizen in his own home, that was a felony. That was assault with a deadly weapon. That was prison time. I made the calculation in a heartbeat. I chose the pain. "Dean," I said, keeping my voice steady and loud enough for the microphone to catch every word. "Please leave. You are trespassing. I do not want any trouble." Trouble. Dean laughed. A wet, ugly sound. "You are the trouble, Vic, and I am the solution." He swung. He didn't use the bat, thank God. Even through the haze of drink and rage, some part of him must have understood that was murder. Instead, he dropped the bat and came at me with his fists. His first punch landed on my jaw. It was a sloppy, looping hook, but it carried the weight of a 200 lb man behind it. My head snapped back. I tasted copper. I felt my lips split against my teeth. I stumbled backward, playing up the weakness. I fell against the bookshelf, sending a vase crashing to the floor. "Please," I said, raising both hands in a defensive posture, making sure not to strike back. "Dean, stop. You are drunk." "Shut up," he screamed. He grabbed me by the shirt collar and drove me into the wall. He cocked his fist again. "This is for Brittany," he yelled. He hit me a second time in the ribs. I grunted. The pain was sharp and breathless. I felt a bruise bloom on contact. I let myself slide down the wall to the floor. I curled into a ball, shielding my head. "Is that all you got?" He spat, driving a kick into my thigh. "You are pathetic. You are weak." I stayed down. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I knew the silent alarm had been tripped the moment the glass broke. The local precinct had a response time of under 5 minutes. Dean was panting now, looming over me, drunk on the feeling of conquest. He thought he had won. He thought he had delivered a lesson. "See how it feels," he taunted. "See how it feels to be powerless." I looked up at him through the darkness. My jaw throbbed and my ribs burned, but my mind was razor sharp. "I am not the one who is powerless, Dean," I whispered. Before he could make sense of what that meant, the room flooded with red and blue light. The siren didn't chirp until the cruiser was right outside the door, a tactical silence. Dean froze. He looked at the open doorway. He looked at the strobing light reflecting off the broken glass. Confusion moved across his face. His hands dropped. "Police, show me your hands." 2 officers came through the door, weapons drawn. They saw a shattered window. They saw a baseball bat on the floor. They saw an elderly man bleeding on the ground. And they saw a drunk man standing over him. It was not a complicated scene to read. "Get on the ground now." Dean blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Wait, no, you don't understand. He started it. He stole my daughter's wedding." "Get on the ground!" the officer roared, moving in. Dean tried to step back, raising his hands in a clumsy gesture. "I am the father. I am just defending my family." The officer had no interest in family dynamics. He was focused on the threat. He took Dean to the floor. I watched from my place against the wall as they put the cuffs on him. I watched as they read him his rights. The bravado collapsed out of him in real time. What replaced it was raw, naked fear, the look of a man who had just grasped the full weight of his mistake. "Breaking and entering assault and battery, you're under arrest," the officer announced. Dean's gaze swung to me as they wrenched him upright. His eyes had gone wide and desperate. Vic, tell them it wasn't what it looks like. Tell them this whole thing is a misunderstanding." "Vic, prison isn't an option for me. I've got a record. They'll pull my parole." I eased myself to my feet, one hand braced against the bookshelf. I dragged the back of my hand across my bleeding lip. Then I turned to the officer. "I am pressing charges," I said, my voice steady and deliberate. "And I recorded the whole thing." Dean's legs went out from under him. He understood. Right then, the full picture clicked into place. He had not come here to confront me. He had come here to destroy himself. They hauled him toward the door while he bucked and yelled about civil liberties, and I quietly stopped the recording. I made my way to the hallway mirror. The swelling had already started. My shirt hung off me in tatters. The reflection said, "Victim." But looking back at myself, that is not what I saw. I saw someone who had just exchanged a busted lip for an enemy's freedom. Call it an investment. The paramedic showed up shortly after. He checked my pupils. "Sir, you absorbed quite a bit of punishment out there," he said, his voice careful and kind. "We need to get you looked at." "Agreed," I said. "Let's move." I needed the medical file. I needed X-rays on record. I needed every contusion cataloged with a timestamp admissible in court. Brittany wanted content for her audience. I was about to deliver something far better. Flat on the stretcher as the ambulance rolled, I took out my phone. The video went to the cloud. Then I fired a copy to Clive Pemberton with a message 2 words long: "Execute him." Clive came back immediately. "Received. I will have the arraignment judge review this before he finishes his morning coffee. Bail is off the table." I shut my eyes as the vehicle pulled into traffic. My ribs throbbed steadily, but what I felt deeper was release. Dean was out of the picture. The biological father was in a cell. That left only Brittany and Diane holding the line. And they were about to discover that the man they had counted on, their enforcer, their shield, their champion, had been nothing but a pawn sacrificed in a game they never had any business playing. The siren climbed above the rooftops as we drove. To the rest of the city, that sound meant crisis. To me, it was a fanfare. Saturday arrived without sunlight. From my hotel balcony in Rome, I had already pulled up the forecast for Illinois heavy rain all day, no relief. The meteorologists, for once, had called it perfectly. This was not ordinary rain. It was the kind that feels like punishment, a freezing, wind-swept curtain that bleaches the color from everything and makes the air taste like dread. Fitting weather for what amounted to a burial, because a marriage was preparing to die before it had ever properly lived. I was not in attendance, naturally. Thousands of miles away, I was finishing a plate of wild boar ragu. But the internet is a generous archivist of catastrophe, and Brittany, in her relentless compulsion for an audience, had opted to stream the ceremony live. She had framed it as an act of defiance, the resilient heroine pressing forward despite everything. She expected admiration. What she got was spectators at a demolition. The venue bore no resemblance to the original plan. The vineyards had vanished. The chandeliers were gone. The vintage Bentley was a memory. The ceremony was now happening in the backyard of Cody's parents' home, in a part of town Brittany had once dismissed in conversation as the trenches. A mean little rectangle of waterlogged turf hemmed in by a chain-link fence that tilted at a sorry angle. 2 oak trees had been pressed into service as anchor points for a blue plastic tarp stretched overhead, its corners snapping in the gusts like a flag of surrender. The head count told its own story. 200 invitations had gone out. 12 chairs were filled, mostly Cody's family cousins and uncles in suits that didn't quite fit, each holding a can of something cheap. The glamorous circle Brittany had spent years assembling, the influencers, the socialites, the models who always seemed to appear in her photos, had evaporated. Poverty and scandal had done what no uninvitation could send them scattering. Diane was handling the camera, and her grip was unsteady. The wind ate into the microphone, turning the audio to noise, but the picture held steady enough. The back door of the house swung open, and Brittany emerged. She was wearing the dress, the $10,000 gown I had declined to finance, which meant some other maxed-out card was about to find out about it. A cathedral dress. A coronation dress. Not a dress for this. The instant her heel met the lawn, the earth claimed it. The mud was the deep adhesive kind. It took her shoe and refused to give it back. She lurched forward, seizing the doorframe to keep herself upright. The white lace hem met a film of oil-sheened water on the ground and began wicking brown up through the fabric with each labored step. No music played. The portable speaker they'd positioned had surrendered to the rain 10 minutes before she walked out. The only soundtrack was the storm and somebody's dog 2 yards over barking at nothing. She covered the distance to the altar, a corridor of soggy cardboard that had long since begun returning to pulp, with her hair ironed flat against her head by the downpour and mascara etching dark channels down both cheeks. A bride transformed into wreckage before she arrived. Cody stood beneath the tarp, waiting for her. Every line of his face said he did not want to be there. His suit was fully saturated, shaped to him like a second skin. He watched her approach without warmth, without tenderness, only the slow, grim inventory of a man tallying what his choices had cost him. He catalogued the mud creeping up her gown. He took in the sagging fence line. He looked at the life he was about to sign up for, and something behind his eyes went flat. Brittany made it to the altar, trembling hard enough that her shoulders shook. She extended her hands toward Cody. He left his buried in his pockets. "Can we just finish this?" he said under his breath. Diane's phone caught every syllable. The officiant, a buddy of Cody's who'd picked up his credentials from a website for $20, cracked a waterlogged notebook and cleared his throat. He raised his voice above the thunder. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman." He never got to the next line. A gust peeled one corner of the tarp free. The whole sheet swung down and cracked Cody across the face, a cold, sodden slap, then unloaded the gallon of rainwater it had been cradling directly over him. That was the seam that gave way. Not the mountain of debt. Not his father-in-law's mugshot. The water. The raw, inescapable indignity of standing in the mud while the sky dumped on him. Cody cleared his eyes and looked at Brittany, weeping without sound, her face a ruin of streaked makeup. "I can't do this." Brittany went rigid. "What?" "I cannot do this," Cody said, again raising his voice. "Take a look around, Brittany. Really look. We are ankle-deep in mud. My father is indoors watching wrestling because he can't bring himself to pretend this is real. Your father is behind bars. Your mother has no place to live. And you." He waved a hand at the ruin of her dress. "You stopped being the prize the moment the money dried up, Britt. The deal was a house. The deal was a trust fund. The deal was a whole life handed over." Brittany made a sound, pure, unguarded shock. "Cody, you can't mean that. You love me, do I?" A short, brutal laugh, sharp enough to cut through the rainfall. "Or was it the St. Bart's weekends I loved? The dinners at a Linnea? The fact that your stepfather covered my car insurance every month?" He ducked out from under the collapsed tarp and let the downpour take him completely. "I am 27 years old, Brittany. I am carrying almost 100 grand in new debt from this week alone. My creditors are ringing my mother's house. Tell me what I am supposed to be getting out of this. A basement apartment and a front row seat to your grievances." He dropped his head once side to side. "No, I'm out. I'm done absorbing the losses." He pivoted toward the house and walked. "Cody." The scream tore out of Brittany. She lunged after him, but the gown had turned to deadweight-soaked fabric and clinging mud fighting every stride. Her feet went out from under her. She hit the ground face first, fully submerged in the sludge. The image was total. The princess face down in the mud. Cody never broke stride. He didn't turn around. The back door opened shut behind him with a crack. Diane dropped the phone. The phone had fallen sideways, capturing nothing but gray sky and soaked grass, but the microphone kept picking up everything. Brittany's voice was still coming through, and it wasn't the sound of grief. It was the sound of a child who had never once been denied anything, suddenly confronted with the word no, and completely unable to absorb it. "Come back," she shrieked, her voice cracking raw. "You cannot leave me. I am a Hargrove. I am a Hargrove." But she wasn't a Hargrove. She never had been. She was a Bowen, and now she was simply a woman alone in the downpour, covered in mud, beginning to understand that without my checkbook behind her, she was utterly invisible to the world she had worked so hard to impress. The stream cut out without warning. Either the battery gave out, or Diane finally understood that the audience had seen more than enough. I shut my laptop. A waiter set a fresh espresso at my elbow. "Is everything all right, signore?" he asked, clocking the expression on my face. "Everything is perfect," I told him. I lifted the cup and drank. The coffee was dark, rich, and bitter, exactly like justice tends to be. The wedding was finished. The marriage had never really started. The coalition of opportunists had turned on one another exactly as I had always known they would. Starve a pack of wolves long enough, and they stop hunting as a team. They start feeding on the weakest among them. Cody had walked away, financially ruined, but ambulatory. Brittany had been hollowed out socially, emotionally, publicly. Diane was watching the retirement plan she had constructed on my back dissolve into the mud alongside the dress I had refused to buy. I leaned back in my chair and took in the Roman sunset. The city glowed amber and gold in the fading light. I drew a long breath. For the first time in 15 years, the pressure in my chest was gone. No looming invoices, no performance expectations. I was free. But I had not yet finished the job. One act remained, the legal finale, the last nail driven cleanly through the lid. Because while they were face down in the mud, I still had a court date on the calendar. And I intended to walk through that courtroom door, pressed, suited, and composed, ready to recover the one thing they had tried to strip from me alongside everything else. My name. The courtroom carried the smell of floor wax and old coffee, a combination I had spent 4 decades associating with corporate negotiations and boardroom standoffs. Today, it smelled like the final curtain of a tragedy. I took my seat at the defendant's table in a navy blue bespoke suit I had acquired in Milan. The Roman sun had left a tan across my face, and my hands rested without trembling. Across the aisle, things looked considerably less composed. Diane sat hunched forward in a black dress that swam on her frame, something she had pulled from a discount rack, no doubt, after I had sent her entire wardrobe off to charity. A week in a budget motel with a daughter who had unraveled and a future son-in-law currently awaiting trial had carved years into her face. Beside her sat her attorney, Mr. Crow. He was exactly the species I had anticipated, a scavenger in a budget suit, the kind of lawyer whose face appears on bus shelter advertisements. He kept tapping his pen against the table in short, sharp bursts, running what he imagined was a dominance display. He had no idea that I had stared down federal regulators and survived hostile acquisition attempts. A man like Crow was not a threat in my ledger. He was a rounding error. Clive Pemberton sat to my left. Motionless, he did not fidget. He did not shuffle papers or click his pen. He held himself with the coiled, unhurried patience of a predator with no need to announce itself. "Do all rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Wakefield entered a woman somewhere in her 60s, with a gaze that had absorbed every variety of human dishonesty the bench could produce. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed both tables with an expression that was already faintly tired. "Or, Mr. Crow, you may proceed," she said, her tone carrying the mild tedium of someone who had heard this overture before. Crow rose, buttoning his jacket as he crossed to the center of the room and launched into his performance. "Your Honor," he said, voice amplified and hand sweeping toward Diane, "we are here to correct a profound injustice. My client gave 15 years of her life to this marriage. In return, she received financial abuse, abandonment, and calculated cruelty. Her husband, Mr. Hargrove, secretly liquidated their marital home, dismantled their shared assets, and departed the country, leaving her with nothing. We are requesting an immediate freeze on all of Mr. Hargrove's accounts, spousal support at $10,000 per month, and an equal share of the marital estate retirement accounts included." Diane pressed a tissue beneath her eye on cue, a practiced touch. Crow continued. "Mr. Hargrove points to a post-nuptial agreement. We contend that document was produced under duress. Mrs. Hargrove was pressured into signing it without independent representation, coerced by a man who controlled every financial lever in the household. That agreement is invalid, and she is entitled to half of everything." He returned to his seat, looking satisfied with himself. Clive Pemberton rose without hurry. He did not move toward the center of the room. He stayed where he was. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low and deliberate, carrying the particular gravity of someone who does not need volume to command a room. "We are not here to adjudicate feelings. We are here to examine facts." He lifted a single document from the table. "Exhibit A, the post-nuptial agreement, executed 5 years ago, notarized, and contrary to Mr. Crow's characterization, reviewed by independent legal counsel at the time of signing." Crow was on his feet. "Objection, that counsel was retained by Mr. Hargrove." "Overruled," the judge said flatly. "Continue, Mr. Pemberton." Clive approached the bench. "The circumstances surrounding this agreement are material, Your Honor. Counsel claims his client was manipulated. The reality is that Mrs. Hargrove had accumulated $150,000 in gambling debts." A current moved through the room. Diane's posture locked rigid. She had not shared that with her attorney. Clive set a stack of bank records before the judge. "These are statements from 3 casinos in Joliet. These are the corresponding withdrawal slips from their joint savings account. And this is the wire confirmation showing Mr. Hargrove paying off a loan shark directly to prevent physical harm to his wife. Mr. Hargrove absorbed that debt on a single condition, that she relinquish her claim to his premarital assets, insulating his financial foundation against the consequences of her addiction. That is not coercion, Your Honor. That is a rescue operation." Diane's face had gone the color of old brick. Crow leaned toward her and hissed something under his breath. Why hadn't she told him? But Clive was not finished. "We are not, however, resting solely on the gambling history," he continued, turning to face Diane directly. "We are invoking the conspiracy to defraud provision embedded in Clause 4 of the agreement." He returned to the table and retrieved a small USB drive. Clause 4, Section B provides that should the spouse engage in any scheme against the financial interests of the primary earner or attempt to redirect assets to a third party through deception, the agreement becomes fully binding and all spousal support is forfeited. Crow let out a short laugh. "Conspiracy. Your Honor, my client has been a loyal and devoted partner throughout this marriage." Clive's expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but something colder and more unsettling. Your Honor, I would like to enter Exhibit C, an audio recording obtained on the Friday, preceding the scheduled wedding ceremony. I kept my eyes on Diane. She looked bewildered. She was turning over memories, trying to locate what she might have said and where. She did not know a recording existed. Clive connected the drive to the court's AV system. This recording was captured on a device lawfully placed within the personal property of Mr. Hargrove, specifically inside the pocket of a suit jacket he had lent to Mr. Dean Caldwell. Dean's name landed on Diane like something physical. The color drained from her entirely. Clive pressed play. The speakers crackled to life. Dean's voice came through unmistakably. "Man, I love this room. Smells like money." A rustling of fabric. "Then, Di and I were talking last night. She is worried about you. She thinks you are getting too old for a house this size." I watched Judge Wakefield. Her brows rose by a degree. The recording continued, Dean's voice loose with arrogance. "We were thinking, after the wedding settles down, maybe it is time for a change. Put the place on the market. Take the cash, set you up in a nice little condo in Arizona. The leftover equity could really give Brittany and Cody a proper start in life. And Di deserves to enjoy herself a little, don't you think?" Diane brought both hands to her mouth. Her shoulders began to shake. Then Clive produced the finishing blow, a segment recorded later that same evening, captured when Dean met Cody at the bar, enhanced for courtroom clarity. The old fool swallowed it whole. Di has him completely wrapped around her finger. She says once the honeymoon clears, she is filing for divorce regardless. We just need him to pull the equity out of the house first, convert it to cash. Then we take half. Perfect retirement plan. Silence settled over the room like a lid. Absolute airless silence. The recording stopped. Clive faced the bench. "Your Honor, what you have just heard is Mr. Dean Caldwell, the individual Mrs. Hargrove personally championed for inclusion in the wedding party, openly confessing to a scheme devised in concert with Mrs. Hargrove to defraud my client. The plan was to drain his home equity through the wedding, then initiate divorce proceedings to seize half. A coordinated financial predation." Crow sat down. Crow said nothing. He closed his folder and set it down. He recognized a sunken vessel when he saw one. Diane surged to her feet. "That is a lie. That is just Dean talking. I never said any of those things." "Sit down, Mrs. Hargrove." Judge Wakefield's voice cut through the room like a blade. The judge looked at me. Then she looked at Diane. What registered on her face was not neutrality. It was contempt. "I have heard sufficient evidence," she said. "No recess required. The duress claim is denied. The post-nuptial agreement stands. It is valid and fully enforceable. Moreover, in light of the conspiracy to defraud evidence now before this court, I am granting Mr. Hargrove's motion to dismiss the spousal support claim with prejudice." The gavel came down. The crack of it rang off the walls like a shot. "Mrs. Hargrove, you are awarded nothing. You are liable for your own legal fees. Mr. Crow, I would advise collecting your retainer in advance, as there appear to be no assets here worth attaching." She closed the file. "Dismissed." Diane let out a wail that bounced off the mahogany paneling and filled the room. She seized Crow's arm. He pulled free and snapped his briefcase shut with both hands moving fast. "You told me we would win!" Diane screamed at him. "You told me I would walk out with the house. I didn't know you and your ex-husband were running a long con." Crow shot back. "Good luck to you, Mrs. Hargrove. Do not contact my office again." I got to my feet. Clive extended his hand, and I took it. "Well executed, Clive," I said. I buttoned my jacket and turned for the door. I had to pass her table on the way out. Diane looked up at me. Her eyes were raw, her mascara long gone, her face stripped of every pretense. She looked older than I remembered, not the woman I had married, but the worn, desperate gambler beneath the surface I had chosen not to see for 15 years. "Victor," she whispered. "Victor, please. I have nowhere left to go. Brittany is sleeping on someone's couch. I cannot keep living out of a motel room." I paused. I looked down at her. "You have Dean," I said quietly. "He is in a jail cell." She sobbed. "You put him there." "Then wait for him," I said. "You two are well matched." I walked out through the courtroom doors. The corridor beyond was bright and hushed. I passed the vending machines. Brittany was camped there, eyes on her phone, waiting to hear that her mother had cracked open the vault for her. She looked up the moment she registered me. She rose from her seat, something hopeful crossing her face. "Dad," she said. I kept walking. I pushed through the heavy double doors and came out into the open air. It was clean out there. No floor wax, no stale coffee. It smelled like the kind of afternoon that belongs entirely to you. My name was mine again. My dignity was back on its rightful shelf. And I had one final meeting to attend with a young woman who had spent weeks casting herself as a victim and was about to learn that the last trust fund with her name on it was moments away from being turned to ash. I came down the wide limestone steps of the courthouse, the accumulated weight of the past several weeks releasing with each stride. The sky was sharp and clear, the sort of autumn afternoon that suggests the turning of a page. I raised my hand for a taxi ready to go directly to the airport and put a continent between myself and the ruins of what had once been the Hargrove family. I never made it to the curb. Footsteps behind me, fast, uneven, the frantic rhythm of heels against pavement. I had no need to look. That particular sound had become its own kind of signature. Brittany, naturally. Diane was probably still inside weeping on Crow's vacated chair. But Brittany was 26 years old and still believed that the right arrangement of tears could reverse a court ruling. She caught up to me, winded color high in her face. She bore no resemblance to the polished, well-lit influencer who had smirked at me across the table at Alinea. Her hair was shoved into a tangled bun. Her eyes were swollen half shut, and the coat she was wearing looked like it had not seen a dry cleaner since the previous administration. She grabbed my arm fingers, pressing hard. "Please," she gasped. "Please, just stop. We need to talk." I dropped my gaze to her hand on my sleeve and kept it there, saying nothing, until the cold steadiness of it registered, and she withdrew her grip, pulling back into herself. "I have a plane to catch, Brittany," I said. My voice carried no heat. 5 minutes. She pressed eyes already filling. "After 15 years, you owe me at least that. You can't just delete me, Dad. I'm your daughter." I gestured toward a stone bench beside a dry fountain at the edge of the plaza. "Sit," I said. She sat. She looked diminished, small, folded in on herself. I stayed on my feet. I wanted the height. I wanted her to have to look up at the man she had spent so long looking past. I didn't mean any of it. The words came pouring out, falling over each other. The video, the live stream, Mom pushed me into all of it. She said it was the only way to bring you back. And Dean, he threatened to disappear again if I didn't go along with the whole real dad storyline. I was scared, Victor. I was just a frightened girl reaching for her father's approval. You know how I get. I make bad choices sometimes, but I love you. You are the only father I have ever actually had. She reached for my hand. "I ended things with Cody," she said, voice dropping. "You were right about him. He was after the money, nothing more. And Mom, I'm done with her. I'm moving out. I want to rebuild from nothing, but I cannot do it by myself. I have nowhere to go. I have debts, Victor. Real ones. Frightening ones. I know you are angry, but you are not a cruel man. You would not let your daughter go under. I watched her work through the performance. It was a polished piece, more controlled than the live stream, better calibrated. But the fundamental problem with habitual liars is that they credit everyone else with their own forgetfulness. She had apparently decided I had no memory of the invitation handed across the table with that particular smirk. No memory of the just Victor remark. I reached into my briefcase. I caught her eyes dropping to the leather bag. Something sparked in them, a quick, reflexive flare of hope. She was already deciding I was reaching for a checkbook. She thought the window was sliding open again. I set a thick blue binder on my knee. Not a checkbook, a trust document. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, holding it up. She shook her head and wiped her nose. "No. This," I said, tapping the cover, "is the Brittany Hargrove Education and Wedding Trust. I established it 10 years ago, directly after I sold my first company. I deposited a lump sum into a high-yield account. The intent was simple: regardless of what became of me or my circumstances, you would always have a floor to stand on." Her eyes went wide. She straightened up on the bench. "A trust," she breathed. "How much is in it?" I opened the binder to the financial summary. I ran my finger down to the bottom line. $500,000, I said. $500,000. The breath she drew in was audible. I could see the arithmetic moving behind her eyes, the florist, the caterer, the credit card balances, and still enough left for a down payment somewhere livable. She was already spending it. She was already composing the comeback video in her head. "Oh my God, Dad." The smile broke through the tears like a light thrown on. "I knew it. I always knew you loved me. Thank you. Thank you. This changes everything." She reached for the binder. I pulled it back. "Oh, sit down, Brittany." I said, a quiet sharpness in my voice. She froze, hands suspended in the air. "I am not finished. This trust is not a gift," I said, working through the pages. "It is a contract. And like every contract I have ever written, it carries conditions. I drafted them myself specifically to ensure the money would build a responsible person, not sustain an entitled one." I found page 12. Clause A. I read the education stipulation aloud. "The beneficiary must provide verified proof of graduation from an accredited 4-year university with a GPA of 3.0 or above." I looked up at her over the top of the page. "You told us you graduated from Northwestern University 2 years ago. You posted photographs in a cap and gown. We celebrated. I gave you a diamond bracelet." She looked down at her lap and began picking at a loose thread on her coat. "Yeah, well, I did graduate. Obviously." I pulled a letter from the back of the binder. Northwestern University letterhead. "This is a response from the registrar's office," I said. "I requested a copy of your transcript in order to satisfy the trust's verification requirements. It turns out, Brittany, that you did not graduate. You withdrew in your sophomore year to pursue a career as a content creator. The tuition money I was sending you went toward cosmetic procedures and buying followers, and the diploma you showed your mother was a forgery." The color left her face entirely. "Victor, I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," I said, cutting her off cleanly. "You misappropriated tuition funds. That is fraud. I was prepared to set that aside. I was willing to waive the education clause entirely if you had satisfied the second condition." I turned the page. "Clause B," I said, and let my voice drop by a register. The character stipulation. I read the legal language aloud, each word precise and deliberate. The funds shall be released in full on the day of the beneficiary's wedding, provided that the current legal guardian and stepfather, Victor Hargrove, is acknowledged, respected, and honored as the father of the bride during the ceremony and planning process. Any act of public humiliation, disavowal of relationship, or malicious intent toward the grantor will result in the immediate revocation of the trust. I shut the binder with a clean snap. You had one job, Brittany. Not to be a scholar, not to achieve anything remarkable. Simply to treat the man who raised you with a fraction of the dignity you extended to a stranger who fathered you and disappeared. That was the entire requirement, and you couldn't clear it. You had to make your statement. You had to tell the world I was just Victor. You had to scrub me from the story because I didn't fit the image you were selling. Brittany was trembling now, not from the cold, from the understanding of what was coming. Dad, please, she begged, dropping to her knees on the pavement. I'm sorry. I'll fix everything. We can plan another ceremony. I'll post a full retraction. I'll tell every single person who watched that video that you are the greatest father alive. Just give me one more chance. I have nothing left. I cannot live like this. I looked at her. I saw the small child I had lifted onto my shoulders at the beach. And then I saw the woman who had grinned while the house I built was being dismantled. The woman who had watched in silence while strangers on the internet called for my blood. I reached into my pocket for a gold pen. Retractions are no longer available, Brittany. The trust carries a final clause. If conditions go unmet by the wedding date, the grantor holds sole discretion to redirect the funds. I set the binder open on the stone bench and turned to the beneficiary page. I crossed out Brittany Colwell. The scratch of the pen cut through the quiet between us. She watched, unable to move, as I wrote the new name in its place, the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. I signed beneath it. No! She screamed, throwing herself at the binder. You can't do that. That is my money. You cannot hand my future to strangers. I stood and lifted the binder above her reach. It was never your money, Brittany. It was mine. And now it is going to men and women who understand what sacrifice actually costs people, who have been ground down by life and still manage to hold on to their honor. People who would never spit on the hand that kept them whole. I took out my phone and photographed the signed page. I pressed send. It is done. My attorney has the digital record. The transfer is already moving. The account is empty. Brittany went down onto the concrete. No tears this time. What came out of her was something raw, a low, guttural sound of absolute ruin. She folded in on herself, arms wrapped around her midsection, like she'd taken a blow. The arithmetic was finally landing. $500,000, the life raft, the reset button, the clean exit, all of it gone, dissolved by nothing more than her own contempt. I looked at her one final time. You wanted independence, Brittany. You wanted to sever the connection to the ATM. Well, here it is. Congratulations. You are a self-made woman. Go ahead and make something. I turned toward the taxi that had just rolled to the curb. Victor. The sound came from behind me, raw and broken. Daddy, please don't leave me here. I opened the car door. I stopped. I looked back once. She was a collapsed heap of stained fabric on the pavement, pigeons circling the dry fountain beside her. Goodbye, Brittany, I said. I got in and pulled the door shut. O'Hare International Airport. I told the driver. International Terminal. The cab pulled into traffic. I did not turn to look out the rear window. I took the SIM card from my phone, snapped it cleanly in two, and dropped both pieces into the ashtray. I rested my head against the seat back and let my eyes close. The engine's vibration moved through me steadily. For the first time in 15 years, the quiet around me wasn't hollow. It had weight. It had texture. It was filled with peace and with the shape of whatever came next. Somewhere behind me in that city, $500,000 was completing its transfer, buying warm beds and hot meals for soldiers the country had moved on from. It was the single best use of capital I had ever authorized. 6 months is a substantial stretch in the world of finance, but in Tuscany, it collapses into something that feels like a single long afternoon. The light operates differently here, softer, more patient than the flat gray glare of Illinois. It settles over the vineyard hills in a warmth that works its way into your bones and makes it genuinely difficult to recall what cold ever felt like. I was on the stone terrace of the farmhouse I had bought, with a fraction of what the trust had preserved. The air carried rosemary-turned earth and the dense sweetness of grapes approaching their peak. There was no noise of consequence. Nobody was presenting me with a card to sign. No one was requesting a sweet upgrade or asking me to make myself smaller so they could feel taller. The only sounds were wind through the olive trees, and somewhere in the distance, the low grumble of a tractor belonging to my neighbor, an old man named Aldo, who knew nothing of my history and concerned himself exclusively with the condition of his soil. I poured a glass of Sangiovese, deep ruby pressed from the very vines I could see from where I sat. I brought it to my lips. Dark cherries leather a depth that only reveals itself to someone willing to sit still long enough. It was the flavor of a life that had finally become fully my own. I thought about the world I had left behind, though not with any longing. The way a man pulled from a sinking ship thinks about the water with clear-eyed respect for what it can do, and a deep settled gratitude to be standing on solid ground. Clive Pemberton kept me informed naturally. Weekly dispatches, brief and factual, chronicling the disintegration of what remained. Dean Colwell was a resident of the state penitentiary. He had accepted a plea arrangement on the assault and breaking and entering charges to sidestep the longer exposure the fraud conspiracy would have brought. 3 years, he was finally receiving the free housing and meals he had always believed the world owed him. I pictured him holding court in his cell block, spinning the story of how he nearly brought down a man with serious money, never once grasping that he had been the instrument all along, not the architect. Diane was pulling the lunch shift at a diner in Indiana. Clive had forwarded a photograph taken by a private investigator. She looked spent. The color at her roots had grown out, the salon appointments, now a luxury from another era. She stood in an apron and flat shoes, wiping down a table while someone at the counter raised their voice about lukewarm coffee. There was a certain brutal poetry to it. 15 years of treating me like hired help, and here she was serving strangers for minimum wage. And Brittany, my former stepdaughter, the girl who had staked everything on becoming famous, she got her wish after a fashion. The live stream of her face-down collapse in the mud had spread everywhere, but not as the content she had envisioned. She became a meme, the symbol of entitlement laid bare. She had attempted a rebrand, positioning herself as a survivor and launching a crowdfunding campaign to rebuild. The internet declined to cooperate. Old posts surfaced, the ones showcasing my cars, my dinners, my house, and the mockery arrived in volume. She had quietly deleted every account 2 months ago. The silence she left in her wake was the most authentic thing she had ever put out into the world. I took another pull of the wine. Then my phone moved against the stone table. A number I didn't recognize, a local Italian carrier known only to Clive and a handful of contractors working the property. Or that was what I had assumed. I looked at the screen. A text. International number. Illinois area code. I picked it up. I didn't need to puzzle over the sender. Desperation has its own unmistakable signal. Victor, the message began. It's Di. I got this number through your old accountant. Please don't delete this. My legs ache from standing 8 hours a day. I can't cover the heating bill this month. I know what I did. I know how badly I hurt you. But we shared 15 years. Doesn't that carry any weight? I only need $5,000 just a loan. I will pay you back. Please, Victor. I'm frightened. I sat with the words on the screen. 15 years. She deployed that number like a blade, like a currency she still believed had purchasing power. She hadn't registered that she had spent every last cent of it long before any of this began. She had spent it on casino floors. She had spent it on lies constructed in the dark. She had spent it on the day she sat in silence while her daughter wiped my name from the wedding invitation. I felt nothing. No rage, no pity, no instinct to reach out. The part of me that had been her husband, the part that had always played the rescuer. It died in that hollow kitchen in Winnetka. I turned my gaze to the fireplace built into the terrace wall. The fire crackled steadily, eating through the dry olive wood I'd stacked earlier. The flames moved hungry and bright. I didn't type a response. I didn't block the number. That would have been engagement. That would have been proof she still existed in my world. I rose from my chair and crossed to the fire. The heat pressed against my face. I held the phone up one last time. A sleek, expensive piece of hardware built for connection. But standing there in that moment, it was nothing but a chain. The final thread still binding me to a world of parasites. I tossed it. A casual, gentle, underhand arc. The phone turned slowly through the air, catching the last light of the setting sun, then dropped into the heart of the fire. I watched it rest for a moment on the burning logs. Then the plastic started to bubble. The screen went black, then split apart. Smoke rose around it in thin curls. Every future vibration, every future plea, every future guilt trip, silenced forever by that cleansing heat. I walked back to the table and lifted my wine glass. Then I moved to the edge of the terrace and looked out across the valley. The sun was sinking below the ridge, bleeding the sky in shades of violet and gold. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of the village church began to toll, calling the faithful to evening prayer. I raised my glass to the empty air. I raised it westward, toward the ocean, toward the prison cell, where a man in an orange jumpsuit lay sleeping on a cot. To Dean, I said, my voice even and unhurried in the quiet night. Thank you. I swirled the wine, watching the legs slide down the inside of the glass. You wanted to be the man. You wanted the suit. You wanted the credit. Well, you got it. You picked up the bill for my freedom. You spared me from spending the rest of my life locked inside a prison of my own building. So thank you for footing the tab on this life instead of me. I drank. It was the finest glass of wine I had ever tasted. I settled back into the chair and shut my eyes, listening to the fire pop and hiss as it finished its work. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving me wrapped in darkness. But the dark no longer frightened me. I lit a cigar, the small flame throwing light across my face for just a moment, long enough to reveal a man who was at last completely alone. And for the first time in my life, alone didn't mean lonely. It meant free. I drew on the cigar and breathed a slow curl of smoke into the Italian night. Let them beg. Let them cry. Let them rot. I have grapes to harvest, and that right there is where I let the Italian night have the last word. The cigar, the wine, the valley, and not a single soul left who could take anything else from me. I won't pretend it came without a cost. Years of my life, a house I built from nothing, and the particular kind of grief that comes from realizing the people closest to you were running a quiet calculation the entire time. What it taught me is something I believe God places in front of us eventually, whether we are ready for it or not, the moment we stop bargaining with people who were never negotiating in good faith to begin with. That moment is the beginning of everything. If you take anything from Victor's story, let it be this. First, document everything always. A handshake means nothing if there is no record. Paper recordings, receipts, they are not paranoia, they are protection. Second, when someone shows you who they are through their silence, believe them. Diane said nothing while her daughter erased Victor's name. That silence was the confession. Third, never let the urgency of someone else's plan rush you out of your own careful thinking. The conspiracy nearly worked because Victor was moving too fast to look. Fourth, the most powerful move is often the one no one sees coming, made quietly, legally, and with complete documentation already in hand. I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. Leave a comment below. Do you think Victor handled it the right way? Or would you have done something differently if this story stayed with you? Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Family Revenge Stories, so you never miss what comes next, thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and trust the process.